The Invisible Friend, Book 3 in the Viking Quest series by Lewis Walfred Johnson. Chapter 1, The Outlaw Goat. A sudden gust of wind whipped between the mountains, lashed the water into waves, and caught Brianna O'Toole's reddish-blonde hair. With one quick movement, Bree swept it out of her eyes and turned to face her new life. Just then, a swell of waves lifted the end of the Viking ship as it rested on the shore. Moments before, the ship that brought Bree from Ireland had sailed through a long, narrow waterway to this settlement in the mountains. Now sunlight shone on a waterfall spilling over a high rock wall. Then the sun shone on the blonde hair of a tall woman standing beside the water. Seeming to forget everything else, Bree's enemy, Mikhail, leaned forward. The moment the Viking ship touched shore, he leapt over the side. By the time he touched the ground, the tall woman stood before him. Mikhail straightened to his full height and tipped his head in respect. "Mama," he said. "Son," she answered. A tear slid down her cheek. "You were gone so long, I was afraid." "I know, but I'm here." Relief filled Mikhail's voice. "I am home." A flash of envy, then anger, filled Bree's insides. Home, she wanted to spit out. Mikhail is home, but I'm not. On a summer morning late in the 10th century, Mikhail had planned the raid that brought Bree and others from Ireland to the Orland fjord. Sometimes Bree wished Mikhail could be a friend, and other times she felt angry about everything he did. As Viking sailors set down the ramp, Bree looked into the crowd gathered to meet the ship. There she saw a girl with sandy-coloured hair, brown eyes, and a dusting of freckles across her nose. Who is she? Bree wondered. Why do I think she's someone I know? The girl looked too thin, as if she had been sick, yet she had to be at least 11, perhaps 12. As people streamed off the ship, Bree lost sight of her. Then far up on shore, Bree saw her again. A long single braid hung down on the girl's shoulder. When she tossed it aside, her eyes lit with laughter. Bree knew that motion, that look of poking fun at something serious. Could it possibly be? Across the distance their gaze met. The girl's mouth formed a round O, a gasp of recognition. The surprise of it shook Bree to the centre of her being. "That's my sister Keely!" 1 year younger than Bree, the two had been close friends as well as sisters. Then 6 years ago, Vikings raided the monastery near their home in Ireland and stole Keely away. In a similar way, a more recent raid had brought Bree on a Viking longship to this fjord. Filled with excitement, Bree pushed her way toward the side of the ship. Maybe there's a reason I was captured by the Vikings. Maybe something good will come out of it after all. In that instant of hope, Bree could see herself bringing Keely home to their family. She could imagine Daddy and Mom and each of her brothers and sisters hugging and kissing Keely. Tears would come to their eyes and stream down their cheeks. Keely! Yes, it has to be her! But the girl turned away. A tall Viking stepped in front of Bree, blocking her view. Filled with panic, Bree tried to get around him. By the time she reached the side of the ship, the girl was gone. Bree felt sick with disappointment. It was Keely, she thought. I know it was Keely. But if it was, why did she turn away? Why did she act as if she didn't know me? I'll find her, Bree promised herself, and somehow we will escape together. In the next moment, Mikhail turned away from his mother to face the Irish captives. "Stop!" he called out. When two Irishmen pretended they did not understand, Mikhail held up both hands. "Wait!" Instantly, other Viking sailors formed a line across the shore. No Irish prisoner would pass through that line until the men told that person where to go. In despair, Bree looked around. Here, where the ship had landed, rock walls gave way to a valley. Green fields lined the river flowing through that valley. Close to the river was a line of houses, but nowhere could Bree see the girl she believed to be Keely. Now, like it or not, Bree needed to begin her new life. But first she wanted to say goodbye to the Irish friends she had made on board ship. Standing to one side, Bree looked for them. When Lil came near, Bree caught her new friend in a hug. "Courage to win," Bree whispered. As Lil's gaze met hers, Bree felt a shock of surprise. Only 2 weeks before, this younger girl had been afraid of her own shadow. Now Lil lifted her head and crossed her arms on her chest in their secret sign. "Courage to win, Bree," she said softly back. "Wherever you are, you will be all right," Bree whispered. "I know," Lil's eyes shone with tears, "and you also." Bree swallowed hard. Mikhail said, "I'll be his mother's slave. I'll watch where you go, and we'll try find each other again." When they walked down the ramp, Lil was ahead of Bree. Mikhail motioned Lil toward a sturdy woman with kind blue eyes. Standing there, Bree watched to see what happened with each of her special friends. As a girl growing up in Ireland, she had always longed to travel. Often she had climbed the mountain near her home to gaze through the mists and wonder what lay beyond the Irish Sea. Yet, in the days since leaving Ireland, Bree had begun dreaming about her new quest, being home again with her family. Again she thought of her sister Keely, of walking up to their cottage, opening the door and shouting, "Surprise!" Again Bree let herself hope, if Dev comes and Keely is here. Ever since being captured, since watching Mikhail release her 14-year-old brother Devon on a shore in Northern Ireland, Bree had clung to one hope. 1 year older than Bree, Dev had always watched out for her. If Dev could, he'd be here now, a bag of ransom money in his hand. When Mikhail boasted about his father being chieftain in the Ireland fjord, Dev had learned how to find Bree. But now a tall, slender girl headed towards Mikhail. Like many of the people standing on shore, she was also blonde, but her long, thick hair fell down her back, nearly reaching her waist. As she swept forward like a queen before her subjects, the girl's gaze went from one Irish person to the next, and then stopped on Bree. "Well, Gina," Mikhail droned, "what a way to welcome me home." But the girl named Gina paid no attention. "Who is she?" she asked again. Mikhail looked uncomfortable, but only said, "One of the Irish." Stepping forward, Gina reached out her hand and tipped up Bree's chin with one finger. Bree backed away. The girl followed, saying, "Look at me." Bree lifted her chin, but the girl's finger stayed beneath it. Bree had all she could do to keep herself from opening her mouth and snapping her teeth around the finger. If she had her way, the girl would be hollering with pain. Instead, Bree opened her eyes wide. Without blinking, she stared at the girl with her meanest look that she could muster. The girl stared back. Mikhail laughed. "You've met your match, Gina. You can't beat her down." "No," Gina turned on him, and the coldness in her eyes became a fire in her face. "You think I can't? I've never known a person who hasn't learned to bow before me." "Bow?" Bree asked herself, then realized that she had actually spoken aloud. Gina whirled on her. "Ah, so you know my language too. You will do more than bow. You will grovel in the dust of the earth before I'm through with you. You will be my slave." Bree straightened, threw back her shoulders and lifted her head. With the same movement, she turned slightly from looking at Gina to Mikhail. No words passed between Bree and Mikhail, but in that moment Bree knew he remembered. "No, she won't," Mikhail said. Gina stared at him. Even Bree felt surprised at the strength in his voice, but it was Gina who spoke. "You think not?" A flush of embarrassment crept into Mikhail's neck, then into his face. But when he met Gina's gaze, there was no backing down. "She will not be your slave. She will be my mother's slave." Gina laughed. The hard, cold sound of it sent a shiver down Bree's spine. And then, to her surprise, she forgot everything else. The bleating of sheep and bawling of cattle drowned out the voices of families on the beach. As Bree swung around, she saw a wide, flat-bottomed boat that looked like a raft. The minute it came to rest on shore, the animals started over the low sides. A large billy goat led the rest. The billy headed straight for Gina. "Gina!" Mikhail called in warning. Whirling around, the girl saw her danger, fingers spread wide. She held out her hands to stop him. Her eyes focused on her. The goat kept coming. When Gina sidestepped to the right, he moved with her. When she leapt to the left, he followed. "Help!" Gina cried, but to Bree's surprise, Mikhail stood as still as a rock. Gina whirled on him. "Get that goat!" she commanded. In the moment she turned her back, the billy goat lowered his head and ran straight for Gina's behind. With one good butt, he sent her sprawling to the ground. Trying to swallow her laughter, Bree choked. Instead, a giggle slipped out. Mikhail slapped his leg, echoing her glee. When Gina looked their way, both of them grew instantly quiet. "Uh-oh," Mikhail said softly. "We've done it now." "Is she the girl you're going to marry?" Bree whispered, suddenly curious. When Mikhail didn't answer, Bree hurried forward, offering her hand to Gina. "Can I help you up?" she said, her voice as sweet as honey in the comb. But Gina shoved Bree's arm aside. Slowly, gracefully, Gina rose from the shore, brushed off her skirt, and whirled on Bree. "I will never forget that!" Gina's eyes sparked with anger. "You are my enemy. From this day forward, you will be my enemy forever." "Ah, Gina," Mikhail said, "don't take yourself so seriously." "Seriously? You aren't the one knocked to the ground by this... Gina had no words for him. "This outlaw goat, that's what he is." As Gina stared after him, Bree's gaze followed hers. A short distance away, the billy goat had stopped. Looking at Gina, the goat seemed to roll his eyes. Then, with all the dignity he could bring to the occasion, he started munching grass. "Yes, he's an outlaw goat, all right," Mikhail answered in his most solemn voice. "I can see how dangerous he is." As the billy set off again, the other goats followed. Zigzagging their way between the people on shore, they hurried toward green pasture near the longhouse. "Where did they come from?" Bree asked. "The out farm, the summer pasture," Mikhail pointed across the fjord to where they had loaded the animals. "They've had good green grass all summer, but at the end of September we bring them down. If there was snow or ice on the mountain, we wouldn't be able to get them home." Mikhail pointed to the steep side of a mountain further along the fjord. "Do you see that slanted line? There's a path for the animals to go up. That's where they come down when summer is over." As Mikhail talked, sheep followed the goats. Then a cow, swinging her head from side to side, followed the sheep, still bawling her complaint. Bree looked after the cow and the billy now far up in the pasture. Remembering Gina, Bree giggled. Gina whirled around. With one glimpse into her eyes, Bree knew. No doubt about it, Gina was her enemy. Bree gritted her teeth. All her life, people had treated her nicely. She didn't know how to handle someone like Gina. But I'm going to learn. Somehow I'll get along with her. Maybe we'll even become friends. Then Bree remembered. Being a slave would no doubt set her apart from Gina. With his sea chest on his shoulder, Mikhail started up the slope toward the longhouse and farm buildings. When he turned to speak to Bree, she sensed the change in him. "Come," he said, his voice impatient now. "So, am I supposed to walk behind you?" Bree almost flung out the words. The idea made her angry. More than once, Mikhail had told her his father was the mighty chieftain of the Outlaw fjord. More than once, Bree had wanted to spit back, "And I am a chieftain's daughter too." So far, she had managed to hold her tongue. Now she wondered about it. If her brother Devon managed to raise ransom money, what would happen? Bree's thoughts scurried on. If these terrible Vikings know I'm a chieftain's daughter, will they raise the price of letting me go? Will they demand so much that Dev can't pay what they ask? Ahead of Bree, Mikhail suddenly stopped. Chapter 2, Mikhail's Secret. Mikhail swept his wind-blown blonde hair out of his blue eyes. Turning, he looked back to the waters of the fjord. Strong and beautiful, with sleek sides, his long ship rested on the shore. As always, Mikhail's heart leapt with pride whenever he gazed upon his ship. "My seabird!" Always Mikhail had called it his. In his thinking, at least, it belonged to him. The Viking ship had served him well. Tall for his age and with skin bronzed by the sun and wind, Mikhail felt like what he was, a master of a ship and leader of a crew of men. Soon after he turned 14, his father had put him in charge of this merchant ship that sailed from the Outlaw fjord to Ireland. In Dublin, Mikhail had traded both skins and furs. Then he raided the Irish countryside, stealing precious gems and other treasures. Most valuable of all were the silver coins Mikhail had managed to collect. Collect? Well, that wasn't quite the word. It wasn't what his father would call it, but for now Mikhail wouldn't worry about that. He was home. Gone were the dangerous moments on the open sea. Here he was, safe at last. He had even brought home valuable Irish prisoners. Soon he must face his father and some very big questions. My seabird? Deep inside, where he didn't want to look, Mikhail wondered about it. Since his raid on the Irish monastery, he had asked himself what his father would do when he found out the truth. Turning to Bree, Mikhail saw the troubled look in her eyes. "Where do I go?" she asked. "I'll show you." Along the shore were the other prisoners who had become slaves during Mikhail's raid on the monastery. No matter, he told himself, they're only Irish. Plenty of other Vikings do what I did. Mikhail let a warm feeling of satisfaction fill his insides. This, the first voyage he led, had been successful in every way. He was coming home with his sea chest filled with treasure. Ignoring the shadow in Bree's eyes, Mikhail grinned just thinking about it. But Bree did not smile back. Bowing her head, she stared at the ground. She'll get over it, Mikhail told himself. Before long, she'll even like it here. She won't mind being a slave, surely. Soon all the people in the mountains and valleys around the Outlaw fjord would know how well he had done on his first voyage. From this moment on, his fame would grow. In the great halls of the north, his name would pass from one storyteller to the next. All the world would hear of Mikhail, son of Sigurd, mighty chieftain of the Outlaw. But now Mikhail wondered where his father was, busy no doubt seeing to the people under his care. Sigurd took his responsibilities as chieftain seriously. Mikhail's chest swelled with the pride he always felt when he thought of his father. Then something else rushed in, a fear that Mikhail couldn't push aside as easily as the Irish prisoners. Deep in his heart, Mikhail held a bigger secret, one he must keep from his father, no matter what the cost. A moment later, Mikhail saw him coming. With a strong step and long stride, Sigurd hurried from the river that emptied into the Outlaw fjord. On land owned by his family for generations, Mikhail sat down his sea chest and faced him. With grey-white hair and moustache and beard trimmed close to his face, Sigurd stood tall and straight. His powerfully built hands and shoulders still made Mikhail feel small, but he had learned to watch for the expression on his father's face. Sigurd looked at him with gladness of heart. Mikhail bowed his head in respect. "Father," he said. Sigurd's smile was filled with the warmth Mikhail sought. "You are late," his father answered. "Did you have trouble?" "A storm in the North Sea." When Mikhail told him about it, his father's eyes turned dark with concern. 3 years before, Mikhail's older brother had been lost at sea. Now Sigurd's smile showed his relief. Reaching out, he clapped Mikhail's shoulder. "It's good to have you home, to see you safe, Mikhail." Then Sigurd glanced toward the fjord where prisoners still waited near the ship. Who are these people who came in with you?" "I have brought you slaves, father." Suddenly, Sigurd's face held the stern look that Mikhail dreaded. "You have brought us people who need to eat, and winter will soon be upon us. I have brought you valuable workers. You have brought people who should be home with their families. I asked you to be a merchant. I supplied you with a ship, with men, and with goods to trade. Was it not enough?" Mikhail's chin lifted. "From one rate I am a wealthy 14-year-old. But are you an honest 14-year-old? His father asked. Deep inside, Mikhail felt a flush of anger move from his chest up into his face. Again he bowed his head, but this time he wanted to hide his resentment. As Sigurd turned, his gaze rested on Bree. "And who is this?" Mikhail shrugged as though it wasn't important. "A slave, an Irish lass gathered up from the countryside when my men raided a monastery." Sigurd looked long and hard at Mikhail. "She is under my protection." Mikhail lifted his head. "She is under my protection also. Bree rescued me from drowning and saved my life, and I promised to watch out for her." "See that you do," answered Sigurd. When he extended his hand, Mikhail looked his father straight in the eye and shook on it. "I need to welcome the others," Sigurd said. "We'll talk more at home." As he watched Sigurd head down the slope, Mikhail thought again of the secret he must hide from his father. If he finds out... Mikhail pushed away the thought. He won't. My secret is safe. No one else knows. No one but me and one other person, and that person is far beyond the Irish Sea. Lifting his head, Mikhail grinned. "I'll get away with it. I'm sure of that." Now Mikhail wanted to set down his sea chest where it would be safe. He'd find a place where he could look upon his treasure with no other eyes to watch. "Pay no attention to my father," Mikhail told Bree as they watched Sigurd hurry towards the longship. "My father is a wise and just man, but no matter what he says, you're still a slave." This time Mikhail watched Bree's face. A look as stiff as dried mud had slipped over her eyes and mouth. Mikhail knew what that meant. Sometimes Bree's mask slipped and Mikhail saw how angry she felt. Other times she hid her feelings so he wouldn't know she was planning something. When Bree planned something, it was almost always escape. Coming from the ship, Bree had walked behind him as a slave should. Yet even when she should feel like a slave, Bree somehow made him feel that she was winning. "You know," Mikhail warned, "if you try to run away, it's a very long trip across the mountains." Bree waited, not looking at him. "Any small boat you steal will not help you enough when the winter winds come." Bree turned and looked back to the fjord as though considering the idea. "And there's no food or shelter anywhere along the way." Suddenly Bree laughed. Even Mikhail saw the joke of it. Bree had already shown her ability to find her own food and shelter on a mountainside, and now when she smiled it was as though the sun came out from behind the clouds. Mikhail was almost fooled, but not quite. That smile of hers usually meant he had lost on every count. Whatever she's planning, it's something big, he thought. Chapter 3, Big Brother. The longhouse Bree had seen from the ship was strong and solid-looking. The returning animals had already trampled the surrounding field. So far, no goats nibbled the grass on the roof. "Everyone on the Outlaw fjord knows my father is a mighty chieftain," Mikhail said. "He is wise and just, but my father is much too strict." "Oh?" Bree suspected she knew why. "In the spring, our assembly of freemen, our ting, will decide what to do about people who are lawbreakers," Mikhail told her. "But you will still be a slave." "No, I won't," Bree said. For as long as you live, nothing will change the fact that you are a slave, Mikhail replied. As Mikhail walked on, Bree glared at his back. She wanted only to be home with her family again. The farmhouse ahead was not unusually wide, but very long. The long wall was built with a slight outward curve that made the house wider in the middle than at the ends. It reminded Bree of the way a Viking ship was built. When they reached the door, Mikhail stopped and looked around. "Home," he said, his voice filled with relief. But Bree felt upset again. Mikhail is home, but I'm not. As though she was really a slave, she reached forward and opened the door for him. Mikhail stopped dead in his tracks. He waited as if he didn't trust her. It pleased Bree so much that she almost laughed in his face. "You think you'll win?" she wanted to ask. She, Brianna, best known as Bree, was an O'Toole. Anyone from the Wicklow Mountains knew that an O'Toole did not lose. Looking Mikhail straight in the eyes, she spoke. "No matter how often you tell me I am, I will never be a slave." Mikhail stalked into the house. Inside, Bree saw a large open room. 2 rows of wooden posts held up the roof and divided the space. Near the centre of the room was a long hearth with a fire pit surrounded by large flat stones. An iron kettle hung from a chain in the ceiling. Mikhail's mother, Rika, was already there. Her face shone with the pleasure of having her son Mikhail home. Hurrying over, she again welcomed him, and then she caught sight of Bree. At the look on Rika's face, Bree stepped back. If she had been able, she would have completely disappeared, but Rika was already asking, "And who is this?" Mikhail grinned. "Why, your new slave, Mama." "My slave?" Rika was not pleased. "Where did this slave come from, and why is she here?" "She's an Irish lass, and my special gift to you," Mikhail said. "Bree is here to help you." Bree? Clearly the name was not familiar to Rika. "Brianna. And why would I, your mother, need help? With all the help that I already have." Mikhail shrugged. "If you don't want it, Bree would be glad to go back to Ireland." As he glanced her way, Bree straightened, filled with hope. "Yes, Mikhail, tell your mother that. I want to go back to Ireland," she said. Mikhail frowned at her. Bree kept on. "I will be no help at all. Such a strong woman as your mother, she needs no one." But now Rika was watching carefully, first her son, then Bree. "So," Rika said slowly, "she speaks Norse, our language?" "Yes, Mama," Mikhail smiled. "And does she know anything about cooking?" No, I don't," Bree lied. "I don't know anything about cooking. Only how to make fish soup," Mikhail answered in his most serious voice. "And my son, does she sew?" "No, of course not," Bree lied again. "Only when she's on a Viking ship and must make sealskin garments for herself and others." "My son, can she take care of herself?" Bree didn't even bother to speak. She only shook her head from side to side. As though every muscle had slid out of Mikhail's face, he showed no expression at all. "Only if she's running away from Vikings and must survive on the side of a mountain." "Oh, for how many days?" Rika asked. "For 6 long days and 6 long nights." "Ah," Rika said, "no wonder you were late." "I think this Bree would make a good slave after all. Besides, when you were so kind as to bring your mother a gift." Mikhail bowed. "Yes, Mama," he said softly. "I was only thinking about your well-being." Thoroughly angry now, Bree straightened. "Mikhail, you will be sorry for this until the day that you die. I will not be your mother's slave. I will not be anyone's slave." But just then a shadow crossed to the open doorway. "Yes, you will," Sigurd said. "Our son brought you here. You are under my protection. It is almost winter, and there is nowhere else for you to go." "You see," Mikhail exclaimed, "it's important to listen to my father." "And to me," Rika said. "Come, Bree, I want you to show me how you make fish soup." As she walked over to the fire, Bree did not look at Mikhail. Instead, she held her head high and her back straight. She was so angry with him that she was sure she could start a fire without a spark from any wood. For Bree, making fish soup was easy. She had watched her mother from the time she was a little girl. Then, as she grew in her own cooking skills, her mum had always encouraged her. Mikhail and his father sat down on a bench along the wall. Bree felt sure that at night those benches were used for beds. While Bree worked near the fire, she listened to Mikhail and his father. But something bothered her. When Mikhail arrived with his ship, only a tear slid down his mother's cheek. Mikhail's father only clapped him on the shoulder. "If I came home, Daddy and even my brother Dev would kiss me on the cheek 3 times. Don't these Norwegians love each other?" Instead, Sigurd said, "Tell me again about your voyage." When Mikhail talked about the storm in the North Sea, his father again showed his concern. Rika turned from the fire and walked over to the loom leaning against the wall. For as long as they talked about the voyage, she faced away. "And what about your trading, Mikhail?" Sigurd said at last, and Rika turned back. "Did you use honest scales?" Bree knew what that meant. A chieftain and farmer. Her father was also a merchant. He often talked about the men who secretly added weights to their scales in order to cheat others. "Honest scales? Of course, father." Mikhail's answer came so fast, Bree wondered if it was actually true. Suddenly, Bree felt glad for Sigurd and the honour with which he lived. Bree had no doubt that he led his people well. True, it would never be comfortable holding a guilty conscience before him. Bree had seen Mikhail's eyes when he thought he had gotten away with something. She had also seen his eyes when Mikhail knew that he hadn't. "He's hiding a secret from his father, I know it," Bree thought. "Did you go to my friend Bjorn, the cobbler in Dublin?" Sigurd said. "Yes." Mikhail seemed relieved to be able to say it. "He bought all the skins you sent him and paid a good price too. And what did my friend Bjorn have to say about you, my son?" "He sent you greetings, father." "And nothing more?" Sigurd searched Mikhail's face. Mikhail flushed, then took a bag from within the larger bag of coins Bree had seen on the ship. It wasn't hard to tell that somewhere between here and the ship Mikhail had made 2 other bags of coins disappear. "And Bjorn sent trade goods, ready-to-wear shoes of the sizes you requested." Sigurd nodded, took the coins and weighed them in his hand. But his gaze never left Mikhail's face. "Why do I feel you aren't telling me something?" Sigurd said at last. Mikhail grinned. "I'm a good trader, father, a good merchant. That was the easiest part of the trip." "No doubt. And the hardest part was the raid upon the people of Ireland?" he asked. "One raid made me a wealthy 14-year-old, Mikhail said again, his eyes resentful. "Tell me," Sigurd said, "how would you feel if it was your mother who was stolen away from her home?" Mikhail glanced towards his mother. Again she turned away, this time picking up a piece of wood for the fire. "I sent Hawk to teach you the ways of a sailor and a merchant. What was Hawk doing during the raid?" "He was sick in Dublin, so sick he almost died, father. We couldn't start back until he felt better." "So when Hawk was not looking, you and the other mice played as you wished?" Mikhail looked away, not answering. Sigurd's eyes were stormy now, a look as angry as the North Sea. "Did you kill anyone?" "No," Mikhail said. "Did your men?" "Well, I don't know." "You don't know, or you don't want to know?" Sigurd asked, as Hawk had done. Mikhail looked down. Here and there pieces of straw lay on the hard earthen floor, and Mikhail pushed them with his boot. Leaning forward, elbows on his knees, Sigurd covered his face with his hands. Without moving, Rika stood at the fire, waiting and watching. When at last Sigurd looked up, he seemed to have aged 10 years in the space of a minute. "My son, if you had stolen from someone in our country, I would expect you to pay back what you stole. I would expect you to pay something more to restore honour as well. But how can I ask you to go back to the place where you stole so much? How can you ever pay enough for taking people from their families?" Sigurd sighed as though barely able to speak. "Unless you find a way to set your actions right, you'll be a slave to what you have done." Mikhail looked up. "Me? I'm not a slave." Clearly the idea startled him. "I'm a free man, just like you, father." "No," Sigurd said. "You're a slave to whatever you serve." Mikhail looked away. "My son," Sigurd went on, "find a way to set right the wrong that you have done." Still standing near the fire, Bree forgot to stir the soup. In one thing, Mikhail was right. Sigurd was a wise and just man. Bree felt grateful for the truth that he spoke, but Bree also felt sure of something else. There's still something Mikhail is trying to hide. What secret grips him with terror when he thinks his father will find out? One thought kept going around in her mind. When I learn Mikhail's secret, I'll certainly hold it over him, and I'll use it as a way to get back home. During the voyage here, Bree had learned that Norwegians ate 2 meals a day meal in the early morning and a night meal in the early evening. When the family gathered for their evening meal, Bree saw Mikhail's grandparents for the first time. Grandmother was small and frail, with white hair that waved softly around her face. Grandfather looked much like his son Sigurd. Both had the same moustache and powerful hands, but now Bree guessed that grandfather's health kept him from doing all that he'd like. Rika set long, narrow tables close to the benches along the wall. Still showing Bree where everything was, Rika pointed out the wooden spoons, then put bowls close to the large pot hanging over the fire. From a loaf of bread that was still slightly warm, Bree began cutting slices. Mikhail's 15-year-old brother Court came in just as everyone was ready to start eating. Instead of Mikhail's light blonde hair, Court's was a darker blonde. Though they looked very different, both had blue eyes and stood like proud young warriors. Sitting down on the benches along the wall, the two began talking as if only a day had passed since they had last been together. "So," Court asked, "how did you like seeing the world?" Mikhail's quick look took in his brother's face. "Only half the world," he said, as if it wasn't important. "Nothing exciting happened? No captives taken?" For an instant, Mikhail's gaze rested on Bree. Just as quickly he looked away, but not before Bree saw the resentment in Mikhail's eyes. "No great wealth to bring home?" Court's voice sounded rock-hard, like a hammer slamming against stone. As Bree watched, a cold look settled across Mikhail's face. "So they don't like each other," she realized. "I wonder why." Then she remembered. It was Mikhail's oldest brother, Ivar, who had died at sea. Ivar was supposed to inherit the land. "My favorite brother," Mikhail had called him. So this Court was obviously not his favorite brother. And by right of inheritance, he would own the land if Sigurd died. Taking up a ladle, Bree dipped it into the large kettle. The first helping of fish soup was big, and she set it before Mikhail's grandfather. Next, she served grandmother and set a larger bowl in front of Sigurd. When she served Mikhail's mother Rika, she set the bowl down carefully, trying to show her the honour she would give her own mother. Rika glanced up and smiled her approval. But when Bree served Court a larger portion, he pushed it aside. "I want more," he commanded. Bree picked up his bowl. As she started back to the fire, Court stretched out his foot. Suddenly, Bree tripped. 4. Hayloft Hideaway. As Bree caught herself, soup spilled over Mikhail's shoulder. Jumping to his feet, he ripped off his shirt before the liquid burnt him. Sigurd glared at Court. "We will have no more of that." A half-smile filled Court's face. "Oh, sorry, little brother. Welcome home." Bree caught the look between the brothers. Then she saw the pieces of fish clinging to Mikhail's shirt. Left there, they would begin to smell. Beneath the surface of everything Court did, Bree felt an anger he did not bother to hide. A spark of resentment seemed to enter his eyes whenever he looked at Mikhail. Why would an older brother resent one who was younger? Mikhail seemed to accept his brother's welcome, but when he sat down again, Mikhail had a flushed look that told Bree he was trying to control his anger. Secretly, she felt glad that someone seemed to be getting the better of Mikhail. Bree returned Court's bowl with a larger portion. As she started back to the fire, Mikhail opened his mouth as though planning to speak. Bree had no doubt that if he did, his anger would pour out in a torrent. But suddenly Mikhail looked toward his mother. A half-smile on her lips, Rika waited as Mikhail turned to look at his father. Tipping his head in respect, Mikhail spoke. "It's good to be home again." As Bree swallowed her laughter, she choked. Quickly she moved away from the family, but there was something she now knew. At sea, she had seen Mikhail as a bold leader who seldom showed fear. No wonder he knew how to be a tyrant on board the Viking ship. He had learned those traits by being picked on by an older brother. When Bree returned with a bowl for Mikhail, she stayed as far as possible from Court's feet. She gave Mikhail the biggest portion of all. Glancing up, he grinned at her, as though saying, "I'm starved all right, thank you." Dipping his spoon into his bowl, he ate as though famished. When Bree finished serving, she took her own bowl to the end of the room. Away from the family, she sat down on a bench along the wall, and from there she could see the fire and the line of smoke rising to the hole in the ceiling. For the first time since being taken captive, Bree felt glad that she was a slave. She wouldn't have to sit with the two brothers. But then Bree felt lonely for her own family. If her 14-year-old brother Dev had reached home, his words would spill out, making a story of everything. Mom and Daddy, Adam, Kara and Jen would all lean forward, not wanting to miss a word. And I'm not there, she thought. In her whole life, Bree had never felt so alone. Then she remembered Keely. I have to believe that I'll find her. I have to believe that there is some good reason for my coming here. In this strange land, the thought of her sister offered hope. But what if I fail? We'll never see our family again. When tears slid down her cheeks, Bree straightened and promised herself that is not going to happen. As she brushed away her tears, Bree glanced back at the fire. Mikhail's mother was watching her. By the time Bree finished eating, she had decided on a plan. She would start by making friends with the dogs on the farm. When she went outside, wooden bowl in hand, she knew they expected someone else. "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty," she called, and soon the cats were there. She gave them a small part of the leftover scraps, then waited. One by one, the farm dogs came near. At first, They eyed her with a look all dogs give a stranger. Bree waited again, letting them get used to her. Then she scraped another small amount of fish leavings into a bowl. The biggest dogs leapt forward, eating with greedy appetites. A short distance away, a mid-sized black dog sat down on his haunches. Tipping his head from side to side, he studied Bree with bright, beady eyes. As though welcoming her, he woofed. Bree went to him at once and gave him the rest of the scraps. "I will call you Shadow," she told the dog, "and we will be friends." When Bree finished cleaning up the dishes, Rika selected a key from the ring on her belt. Going to a chest, she opened it and handed Bree a wool blanket. As she felt its thickness and warmth, Bree understood the gift Rika had given her. Running her hand over the cloth, Bree smiled her gratitude. "Thank you." But then Bree wondered about it. A blanket from the family supply? But why? Picking up an oil lamp, Rika carried it with her. A narrow passageway led from the large open family area past smaller rooms to a door into the barn. As Bree entered the stable, she felt at home at once. It was dark there, but from the day she had been born, Bree had lived on a farm in Ireland. For as long as she could remember, she had known green fields and cows that bawled their displeasure when a dog nibbled at their heels. She remembered the sheep and the lambs following close after their mothers. Warm with the crowding of animals, filled with the scent of hay, their barn had always been a comfort to Bree. Reaching out, she smoothed the neck of a cow that looked her way. Rika turned, saw Bree stroking the cow. "You like animals, then?" "I do too. They're good friends." Rika explained, "Sometimes you will work here," she stretched out her hand, "and sometimes with me. We have servants who help with the rest of the animals and outside work." "Servants?" Bree asked. "The children whose parents don't have enough food for them in our long winters. The other people who are not strong enough to work a long day. And some people who are strong and work well." "Servants," Bree said again. Suddenly her next words spilt out. "But I am a slave?" "Yes." A strange look passed through Rika's eyes, then was gone. But the tone of Rika's voice was final, allowing no more questions. "A slave." Unable to look at Rika, Bree glanced away. She didn't want to think about being a slave, but then she wondered how many would share the stable. Where are the other servants? "We have other buildings for them. During the day, some of them work here, and some help me, and some work outside." As Bree looked around, Rika spoke again. "Make a place for yourself," she said. "In the cold, dark months of winter, the animals help keep the stable and house warm." Bree nodded. The warmth given off by the animals took the chill from the air. Yet Bree had no doubt in her mind. An Irish winter in the Wicklow Mountains could not be compared to a Norwegian winter. She would burrow down deep beneath the hay. In that large dark barn with no windows, Rika allowed just one light, a small oil lamp that could be set in only one place on a wooden shelf safely away from any hay. Whatever Bree did, it must always be put out whenever she went to bed. "In the night, I want you to care for grandmother," Rika said. Bree stared at her. "But I will be here, and she will be in the house with you." "In the room closest to the fire," Rika said. "When she calls in the night, I will expect you to answer. Give her comfort." "Comfort? But how will I hear? There's a closed door, and the door of the house that will separate us." "You will hear," Rika said. "You will hear." When Mikhail's mother left, Bree picked up the oil lamp and stared down an aisle between stalls. "Is that a horse I'm seeing?" Drawing close, Bree held up a light. Yes, not one horse, but two. As Bree drew close, one of the horses turned and looked at Bree with large, beautiful eyes. "Tomorrow when the sun is up, I'll open the door so I can really see you," Bree promised the mare. Still holding the warm blanket Rika had given her, Bree studied the location of the stalls, the animals, and the door to the outside. Bree felt pleased. By using that door, she could come and go during the night without the family knowing. "I'll look for Keely," Bree promised herself again, "and when I find her, we'll escape over the mountains or through a fjord or—" Bree's imagination knew no bounds. Whatever it took, they would find the way back to Ireland. "How can we fail if we're together?" she thought. But take care of grandmother? Bree was used to sleeping soundly. In spite of what Rika said, how would she possibly hear a closed door? Then Bree saw what she needed. Near the door into the house, a wooden ladder led upward. In the loft above was a large open space filled with hay. When she climbed to the loft, Bree found the hay fresh and sweet-smelling. Breathing deep, she imagined long grasses growing on the mountainsides. Norwegians dried their hay on the slopes. Sometimes someone must have carried this hay home in his boat. Bree smiled. Gathering her blanket around her, she burrowed down into the hay. Soft and comfortable it was, a warm hideaway, just right for an end of September night. If it's safe here, this will suit me well, she thought. In the next moment, she was asleep. When Bree woke, it was to the sound of moaning. Chapter 5, Secret Message. At first, Bree thought it was the wind under the eaves, but the sound increased and had a strange human quality. What was it? And why did the moaning make her afraid? Listening, Bree tried to figure out what it was. The sound was louder now and grew louder all the time. It seemed to come from inside the house, and then Bree knew. Pushing aside her blanket, she felt her way down the ladder. In the dark aisle between stalls, she stumbled against posts. At last, Bree found her way to the door into the house. Rika met her there. "Come," she said, "I'll show you what to do." Mikhail's mother led Bree down the hall to grandmother's room. Beyond lay the large area where the rest of the family slept on benches around the fire. The door of grandmother's room and places along the wall were open to the heat. As Bree drew close, the moaning was loud enough to fill the entire house. 2 small oil lamps flickered in the air currents and shadows danced up and down on the ceiling. Bree found grandmother lying on a wide bench built into the wall. A soft pad protected her old bones from the hard wood, but her discomfort went far beyond that. Grandmother had flung one blanket to her feet and another across the room. Her moans had changed to loud wails now. Bree stared at her. This was the quiet, fragile woman she had met at the evening meal? Rika went to her and knelt on the earthen floor next to the bench. With her arms around grandmother, she spoke. "Grandmother, wake up. This is Rika. I'm here to comfort you. Wake up." But grandmother flung her arms against Rika. "Step aside! Get away! She comes to take me! Get away! Get away!" Rika patted her back. "It's a dream, grandmother." "No, such a strange-looking woman. Why does she come for me?" Rika sighed. "Our gods will take care of you." "But she's a goddess." Grandmother was fully awake now, but her eyes still held their fear. "Take care, Rika. I don't want her to hurt you." "She won't," Rika exclaimed. "I'm strong. That's what my name means. I'll defend you against her." Grandmother shook her head. "No one is strong enough to defend me against this one." "I've brought Bree," Rika said. "She'll stand with me, defending you against the goddess. Bree will be sure that you're well cared for." Turning, Rika motioned to Bree. "Come close," she whispered. "Let Grandma hear your voice." But Bree stood there, rooted to the dirt floor. Grandmother's fear frightened her. "Come," Rika said again. "Speak to her." When Rika drew her forward, Bree had no choice. As she knelt down next to Rika, her hands were shaking. What could she possibly say to help the old woman? Just seeing the fearing grandmother made Bree want to turn and run with fear. "Speak," Rika commanded. "Let her get used to your voice." Close to grandmother, Bree saw the whiteness of her face. How could a nightmare be that terrible, she thought. But then, out of her deep wish to help, Bree began to speak. I am a new friend," she said softly. No new friends," grandmother cried out. "I don't trust anyone new. The goddess comes from the fog, the rising mists." "Grandmother, this is Bree," Rika said. "Remember, she served you fish soup at dinner time." Again, Rika motioned. "Speak to her," she whispered. "Let her hear the softness of your voice." I come from a far land where the mists settle between the mountains," Bree said. No mists, no far land." Rika sighed. "Don't talk about island," she whispered. "Whatever grandmother sees, it must be the same as your country." Island, the same as something fearful? Bree felt angry now, but somehow she had to set that aside or she'd be here all night. "Grandmother," she said, "I am Bree. You can trust me." Trust. The word seemed to fill the air between them. In the dim light of the 2 small lamps, Bree could see that grandmother was listening. "I will take care of you," Bree said. "Listen to a song I learnt when I was just a young girl." Bree started to hum a lullaby. She felt afraid again. Hadn't her brother Dev often said that her singing was fit only for cows? And usually Dev spoke truth, but the minute grandmother closed her eyes, she moaned again. It was easier for Bree to hum than to think of what to say. Then grandmother stretched out her hand. Taking it, Bree held it between both of hers. Rika drew up a blanket, recovered the one thrown across the room, and tucked it around the older woman. The words, Bree thought. Oh no, I can't remember the words of the lullaby. But then she knew it didn't matter. Grandmother wouldn't even understand the Irish words anyway. For a long time, Bree knelt there. humming and whispering kindness to the woman who was so afraid. When Rika slipped away, Bree felt sure she had gone back to bed. At last, grandmother's hand relaxed. The frightened lines in her face disappeared. When she started breathing evenly, Bree knew grandmother was asleep again. Withdrawing her hand, Bree tiptoed out. When she reached the door into the stable, she slipped through and climbed up the ladder. Sinking deep into the mound of hay she had claimed for her bed, Bree pulled the warm wool blanket around her. Tired as she was, Bree could not go back to sleep. Instead, she lay there thinking, is that why I got a family blanket? So I wouldn't bring fleas to grandmother? Whatever the reason, Bree felt grateful for the warmth of the soft wool covering her shoulders, but she couldn't get beyond one thought. What is there in this strange land that would make a kind old woman so afraid? In the early morning, the family had their day meal while it was still dark. This time, Bree cooked porridge, a warm cereal made in a large pot hanging over the fire. Again, Mikhail and his father talked. Court leaned back against the wall, seeming to listen, but not taking part. I grieve for you, my son, Sigurd told Mikhail. I wish that you had walked the path of an honest and wise merchant. I would have given you the seabird. Now you must show me that you can be a merchant, not just a raider. I'll do better next time. I'll prove to you, Mikhail was saying. Sigurd shook his head. Not next time. At the end of 3 trips, we'll decide whether the ship is yours. Resentment flashed through Mikhail's eyes, then was gone. I will make you proud, father, he said. Sigurd's gaze met Mikhail's. You've told me that before. This time I mean it. On my next trip, I'll take 2 ships. 2? Mikhail's face showed his excitement. I have it all figured out. I'll take the seabird with men and trade goods the way I did this summer, and before we leave, I'll build another ship. With what? Sigurd's question shot out like an arrow. How do you plan to pay for this ship of yours? With my share of the money and the silver coins I collected. The coins you collected where? From the Glendalough Monastery and the people. Sigurd's face looked like a thundercloud. Mikhail! I know. If I borrowed money. Borrowed? Mikhail changed the word. Well, if I took money from the man living in the Outlaw fjord, it's an offence punished by death. Sigurd nodded. But if I repaid the money, and if I paid the man something extra to say I was sorry I dishonoured him, the Ting, our assembly of freemen, might outlaw you, or they might let you stay. Yes, Mikhail smiled, as though he had thought of it all. But if I collect something, take something, you mean? Sigurd's voice was as hard as the rock walls of the mountain at the edge of the farm. Steal is the real word you're looking for, Mikhail. But Mikhail didn't seem to hear. Today I will begin work on the ship, he said quickly. I'll get men together. I'll ask a master shipbuilder. No! Sigurd's cry echoed his pain. You aren't hearing me. No! 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 No? Mikhail replied. You will not get your men together. You will not ask a master shipbuilder to help you. I, your father, am a master shipbuilder. You will not ask someone else. His eyes watchful, Mikhail waited. I trusted Hawk to teach you, but you took advantage of his poor health. You did things your own way, Mikhail. No more. No more? Mikhail asked. No second chance? You will not take advantage of me the way you did Hawk. From now on, I will go with you. What? We will work together? Mikhail asked. To Bree's surprise, a grin lit Mikhail's face. He really loves his father, she thought. Yes, we will work together, Sigurd stretched out his hand. When Mikhail shook it, both of them looked happy about the agreement. But Bree looked toward Rika. With careful movements, Mikhail's mother sat down the large bowl in her hands. So now, she said softly, I not only have 1 ship on the open seas, I have 2. The moment she could, Bree slipped out to the barn. As the light of day reached between the mountains, she opened the door near the horses. It was as she thought. Both the mare and gelding were a pale reddish colour, but then Bree stood back, staring. Their thick, light-coloured manes stood up, making their unusual colouring even more noticeable. A dark stripe ran through the mare, down the centre of the back into the tail. Seeing it, Bree felt awed by the beauty of the horses. I will call you Flurry, she said, as she ran her hand along the powerful neck of the mare. When the wind blows cold and snow flurries come, I will warm my heart with thoughts of you, and we will be friends. A short time later, Bree saw Mikhail and his father working down near the fjord. Soon a crew of men gathered around a long, narrow building. What are they doing? Bree asked Rika. They're repairing a shed. They'll use it as a boathouse to build another ship. Clearly, Rika was not happy about the project, but then she gave Bree some good news. Soon they'll go upriver to cut down trees. They'll do as much as they can before winter. Bree could hardly hide her excitement. If Mikhail and his father are gone. Then Bree remembered Court. More than once she had caught the spark of resentment that entered his eyes whenever he looked at Mikhail. Bree could never forget that Court might stretch out his boot to trip her. Even if the others left, she must watch out for him. Tonight, I'll start looking for Keely, Bree promised herself. If I find her, we'll plan how to escape when the men leave. Later that day, Rika sent Bree to the river for water. Bree blinked as she stepped into the sunlight. After the dim light of the house, she felt glad to be away from the oil lamps, the fire, and the smoke that drifted towards the ceiling. Whenever she was indoors too long, Bree felt like the prisoner that she was. Now blue waters lay a short distance away. The afternoon sun lit the waterfall spilling over the mountain on the other side of the fjord. The river that emptied into the fjord followed through a valley. A small cluster of houses lay between Sigurd's farm and the river. When Bree reached the river, she found a large flat stone where she could kneel and dip water out of the stream. In a cluster of trees away from the houses, she discovered a tucked-away hollow between boulders. Stepping her buckets down, Bree looked around, then slipped into the shelter from the wind. There she sat down and sorted out her thoughts. First, she wondered about Lil. She and the 8-year-old girl had become friends on the trip from Ireland. In the days they were together, Lil had put away her scared feelings and found the courage to win. Then Bree thought about her sister Keely. She has to be close by, but how can I find her? And Devon. Countless times Bree had wondered if her brother had reached home safely. If Dev was here, what would he tell me? Bree knew at once. Courage to win, he would say. Jesus, our Lord, is Saviour and King. When they were very young, it had started as a way to encourage one another. If Bree crossed her arms over her chest, Bree knew she was praying. Devon knew she was praying for him. Though he faced the biggest bully in the Wicklow Mountains, it became a signal that helped them when they needed it most. But now Bree's loneliness overwhelmed her. It was much easier to have courage when she and Dev were together. If courage was doing the right thing, even when she was afraid, how could she possibly win? Yesterday she had lied 3 times. In the middle of grandmother's nightmare, she had lost all courage. God seemed far away, not even real. Then Bree remembered something she had needed to learn a long time ago. If I ask God to help me in whatever I face, He will give me the courage to win. Tucked down between the boulders, Bree found a warm spot and started to pray. Please, Lord, please help me. I can't do this. In that moment, she sensed a small voice from deep within. You can't do it? No, but I can. Bree smiled. Sometimes she forgot how simple God made things. It's true, she thought. I can't do this, but God can. Hugging the thought to herself, Bree repeated it over and over again. Already Bree felt better and she knew what she needed. Lord, in this strange land where I can't even talk with friends like Lil, will you be my friend? My invisible, always with me friend? As Bree started back to the house, she crossed a soft stretch of ground near the river. Suddenly, she stopped. Close to the water, someone had drawn a round face with 2 dots for the nose and a single line for a curved-up mouth. The 2 eyes had that same curved-up line as though they were smiling. 2 long lines with X's showed a braid, and on top of the face was a funny-looking tuft of hair. As Bree stared at the drawing, she started laughing. The braid had to be Keely's, and the tuft on the top of her head clinched it. When she was a baby, it was all the hair she had. Keely, it was you! It really was you! Dropping her buckets, Bree knelt down and traced the tuft of hair with her finger. Then she kissed the face. It was the closest she could come to kissing her sister. Leaning back on her heels, Bree looked around, searching the boulders along the river, the nearby pines, and then the mountain tops. Nowhere did Bree catch a movement. Nowhere did she catch even a glimpse of someone half hidden from sight. Bree felt both excited and disappointed. Keely, I know it's you, but please help me find you. Where are you? Chapter 6, Gina. Then Bree realised she had no idea how long the drawing had been there. Had Keely come during the night or early morning? Bree had no way of knowing. Again she stared at the soft ground. It has to be Keely, Bree told herself. She wants me to know she's here, but why won't she let me talk to her, hug her, tell her how glad I am to see her? That's what Bree longed for with all her heart. As Bree watched, the water lapped closer, reaching out for the face drawn in the sand. I almost missed it, Bree thought. I almost missed it, but I'm so glad I didn't. When she returned to the house, Mikhail's mother said, "You're late." "I'm sorry," Bree answered, but would say no more. "Do you know how to weave?" Rika asked her. "Of course," Bree said, her voice stiff. "When I was just a young girl, my mother taught me. That's how we do it in Ireland." But the upright loom that leaned against the wall of the longhouse was very different from the loom Bree used at home. Rika set her to work, tying long vertical threads called a warp on the upper part of the loom. At the bottom of each thread, Bree fastened a weight to hold the thread tight during weaving. As Bree brought the shuttle on a horizontal line, going back and forth between the vertical threads, she held dreams in her hand. Dreams of finding Keely after 6 long years of being apart. Dreams of talking and laughing together, for hadn't Keely drawn a happy face with the mouth turned up in a smile? After the evening meal, Bree again took food to the dogs. Whenever they were even a few leftover scraps, she made sure that she was the one giving them. This time the dog Bree had named Shadow tipped his head from side to side as though looking her over. When he came forward, he wagged his tail. "Good dog," Bree said. Kneeling down, she scratched behind his ears. Shadow wiggled with delight. Even his curled-up tail looked pleased. From that time on, he followed Bree around wherever she was outside. The moment she could, Bree went out to the stable. By the light of the oil lamp, she pulled together everything she needed. The night would be crisp and clear, and she wanted to use every hour while the moon was full. But first she must wait long enough for the family to fall asleep. Then she would quietly open the stable door and slip outside. "Each night I'll go a different direction," Bree promised herself. "I'll find the farms and houses close by. Maybe I'll even find Keely tonight." If they talked together now, they would escape when Mikhail and his father were gone. After blowing out the lamp, Bree climbed the ladder. As she sank deep into the hay, she listened. Outside, a wind had come up. Alone in the dark stable, Bree heard it under the eaves. Then she heard the creaking of timbers and wondered if someone walked where she could not see. "Courage to win," she told herself, and wished her brother was there. "Courage to win, Bree," she thought, reminding herself of all the ways her family lived that courage. Twice she nearly fell asleep, and then at last she decided it was time to leave. Down the ladder she went, through the aisle between the stalls. She had lifted the latch on the door leading outside when she heard it. The moaning started soft and low and built like the mountains along the fjord. "Oh, grandmother!" Bree dropped the latch and leapt away from the outside door. Pulling off her cloak, she dropped it behind a mound of hay. When Rika opened the door from the house, Bree was nearly there. The next morning, Rika told Bree that later that day she could have a few hours off for a religious festival. Everyone would meet in a sacred grove of trees high above the fjord. All day long, Bree wondered what she would find there. Would it be like her own family going to church? Would it be something she didn't know or understand? Shortly before sunset, the family set out with Sigurd, Rika, and grandfather leading the way. Except for grandmother, who stayed home, the rest of the family trailed behind them. Then came the servants, and last of all, Bree. At the river, they took boats across to the other side, then walked up a steep hill. While they reached a grove of trees, there were several bonfires around a grassy area. The people who had gathered together faced an open area with a flat stone and some statues. From the greatest to the least, everyone seemed to have their expected place. As a slave, Bree stood near the back. To her surprise, it was Hawk who led the festival. Bree had first seen him on the voyage from Ireland. With grey-white hair and a flowing beard, he was the person Sigurd had trusted to teach Mikhail to be the master of a Viking ship. Now Hawk's piercing eyes looked out from beneath bushy eyebrows. The flickering bonfires brought shadows to his face and the hollows of his cheeks. Bree shivered. She had hoped to find the peace she felt in her church at home. Instead, she remembered Hawk on the Viking voyage. During the worst of a storm, she had seen him crawl over to the sea chest, reach inside and hold on to the holy book stolen from the monastery. The people Hawk led seemed to believe in the power of their gods to help them. But did Hawk? Bree only knew there was no mistaking the shadows in his eyes. As Hawk stepped back, a girl in the gold dress stood in the open area. Her long blonde hair fell to her waist. Around her, the flames of the fire rose in the darkness. "Gina!" Bree barely breathed a word, but a nearby woman turned to shush her. Bree hadn't seen Gina since the day Mikhail's ship came into Orland. By now, Bree felt more sympathetic about how she would feel if knocked over by a goat. If I went a slave, would we be friends? Then Gina started to sing. Bree had always wanted to be a singer, but long ago her brother had made things plain to her. Again, Bree remembered it was best that she sing to cows, and it did seem to help. Their Irish cows were good milkers, but Gina... Bree wanted to catch every word. At first she had trouble with the Norse words she didn't know. Then Gina's clear voice reached into the furthest corners of the open area. People caught the excitement, they stomped their feet and raised their hammers to Thor. Bree missed going to church with her family. She wanted something to fill the empty spaces in her heart. Instead, what Rika called a festival was filled with a heavy, cold darkness. As Bree listened to Gina's words, something inside her started to change. At first, Bree thought the cold was just from being outdoors, and then she realized it was a spiritual coldness, unlike anything she had ever known. When Bree felt uneasy, the jiggly feeling she had inside told her that something was wrong. "What is it, Lord?" Bree started to pray silently. "What do you want me to know?" In the next moment, Bree sensed the still small voice that she recognized as the Lord. A quiet message prompted her from inside. Sometimes that quiet message brought comfort on the darkest night, but now Bree sensed a warning. "Leave." "Leave?" Bree asked, her eyes wide open as she prayed. "Leave." Bree didn't wait. This was the voice she knew from the Lord, the voice she had heard since a young child, the prompting she sensed when she asked God for help or heard the Bible read. Quietly, with the stealthy movements she had learned since becoming a slave, Bree edged away. Step by slow step, she moved into whatever space she could find between people. As Bree reached the last row, she glanced back. Gina was watching. "She knows I'm leaving," Bree thought. "She'll remember." Bree waited for a few minutes, but Gina waited too. Though she kept singing, she watched Bree, and finally Bree stepped behind a tall man, waited again, and then backed away. As Bree started down the side of the mountain, she wondered what to do. She couldn't take a rowboat. If she did, it would be on the wrong side of the river for the family going home. Finally, Bree sat down on a large rock. On the mountain above her, the flames of the closest bonfires spilled into the darkness. With every breath she drew, Bree felt relieved, as though she had escaped something strange and terrible that she didn't understand. What was it she had known as people lifted their hammers to Thor? From long ago came words she had memorized from the book of John in the Bible, never guessing that she would be a slave. "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Truth. Then she did understand. The real slaves were the people locked in the darkness of their false gods. Yes, that's what bothered her, and with it she knew something else. It fell upon her like a flash of light in a dark and stormy night. "Lord, whether I am slave or free, I belong to you, and you have set me free." Deep within Bree, an idea began to form. If she was going to find Keeley, she needed freedom to roam. But now Bree felt sure that God also wanted her to do something more. Chapter 7, Brown Robe. By the time Mikhail found Bree, others were waiting to use the boats. But Mikhail felt upset about having to search for her. "Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice filled with anger. Bree jumped up from the rock where she was sitting. "I wanted to pray to the God that I know." Mikhail laughed. "We're pleasing the gods we know, and we're praying for that last ship out." Bree glanced down the river to the fjord. "It's very late, isn't it?" As Mikhail stood there, a snowflake drifted down, but he still expected an answer. "Why don't you worship our gods? You aren't in Ireland anymore. It would help you to worship the gods of this land." "My God is everywhere," Bree said, "and he knows I'm here." "How can anyone, even a god, be everywhere? I have many gods and call on the ones I need." Bree's clear gaze met his. "I don't want to come here again." Mikhail stared at her. "Why? You get out of work if you come." On the hill above them, the bonfires still flickered and burned. Mikhail saw more snowflakes against the light of the flames. Faster and faster they swirled around the river. But Bree seemed to not notice. "Mikhail, I'm not a slave. I don't think like one. I can't act like one. I need to be outside to climb the mountains the way I did in Ireland." No, Mikhail would not risk having her run away. His crew of men would think he was weak if she succeeded again. "I want something more to do," Bree said. "Something where I help other people." Though Mikhail had never considered the idea, it wasn't foreign to him. For some strange reason, it was what his mother and father did. "Well, you help grandmother," he said. "It's not making any difference. Aren't you tired of having grandmother wake you up every night? I could read stories to her from the book you stole from the monastery." Inside, Mikhail felt sparks of anger again. "The book the man in the brown robe gave me as a reward for being careful of his people." "Brother Cronin said that?" Mikhail nodded. "He said he'd make a trade, a book of great value for the lives of his people." "A trade," Bree said softly. "Then you gave the book to Hawk. Is he going to tear it apart to keep the gems?" Mikhail shrugged. "Well, I don't know. You'll have to ask him. I told him what Brown Robe said." "Not Brown Robe. His name is Brother Cronin. He was my teacher at that monastery school. When Brown Robe handed the book to me, he said, 'I will pray that this book is well used.'" Bree smiled as though she had received a secret message, and it made Mikhail curious. Then Brown Robe said something even stranger. He said, "The person who reads this book will receive God's sovereign protection from you Viking raiders." "What sovereign protection?" For a moment, Bree wondered what to say. Would Mikhail think he could do anything he wanted and God would make it okay? "It's like the protection a king or queen gives," said Bree finally. "But God can protect people wherever they are. He's promised to be with me always." Mikhail's laugh mocked her. "Your God promises to be with you always." But then Mikhail thought again. "Well, I could use more protection when I go to sea. I better make sure that Bree is along next time." In that instant, Mikhail made up his mind. "I'm tired of having grandmother wake me up every night. You say there are stories in the big book? Maybe since my grandparents are very old." "Yes," Bree exclaimed. "They'd love to hear the stories. That is, I'll tell them stories if your mother lets me walk outside." "Walk outside in winter? Do you know what you're asking? Besides, I can't trust you." "Unless I give you my word." Mikhail wasn't fooled by the meek look in Bree's face. "And you will give me your word?" The hard sound was back in his voice. Bree must have no doubt that she would remain a slave who could do only what she was allowed to do. Chapter 8, The Talking Cow. When Bree heard the hard sound in Mikhail's voice, she knew she needed to get his permission at once. "If I give my word, I will keep it," she said. Mikhail's angry gaze met hers. "I know you will. That's why I ask for it." As though she was lining up soldiers one against the other, Bree thought about it. If she gave her word that she wouldn't run away, she couldn't escape across the mountains. If she found Kili, they would be held here by her own promise. But if she didn't give her word, she had no way to search for Kili. She had tried and couldn't get beyond Sigurd's farm. Though Bree wanted a trade, this was more than she bargained for. Mikhail grinned. "It's a hard choice, isn't it? I can see your thoughts march across your face." "I hope not." Bree felt the hot flush of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. Aloud she said, "I doubt it." Mikhail's grin faded. The hard look returned to his eyes. "I can at that. So, Irish lass, you better make your choice now and be glad if I give you even one small drop of what you call freedom." For only a moment longer she waited. "I promise to not run away." She raised her chin. "Not without telling you." "No conditions," Mikhail shot back. "You promise to not run away." Bree clenched her fists. She was giving up her freedom for Kili's sake, but Bree felt her sister needed freedom even more than she did. When Bree spoke, her voice sounded as hard as Mikhail's. "In exchange for not running away, you will give me 2 things. Ask your mother to let me tell the stories in the big book. Ask that when I finish my work, I can walk in the mountains." Mikhail searched her face as though making sure she spoke truth. For an instant, he glanced down at her clenched fists and then he nodded. Bree lifted her head. The snow flurries had stopped. High above her, the bonfires were dying down, but she saw them as a symbol of all she did not want. Turning her back on them, Bree unclenched her fists and stretched out her fingers. On the walk back to the longhouse, she prayed with her eyes open. "Lord, whether I am slave or free, I want to serve you, not because I must, but because I love you." As Mikhail and his father left the next morning, Bree and Rika stood outside the longhouse. Bree asked Rika about the ship that was still out and not back yet. "It's a merchant ship with many men," Rika told her. "It left months ago filled with trade goods. The master of the ship is a man we all love. Most of the men on board are from fjords and mountains close by. It was this way 3 years ago." When Rika did not go on, Bree knew that she couldn't. Bree also thought that she knew the rest of the story. "Was it 3 years ago when your oldest son sailed away and didn't return?" she asked softly. Rika's face was set, her lips pressed together as if she couldn't speak. Ivar? Bree asked. His name was Ivar, right? Rika nodded, though her face seemed carved in stone. Her eyes showed her pain. Soon Mikhail, Sigurd, and their crew of men disappeared around a bend in the river. Rika said they were going upstream where trees grew on the slopes. They'll sleep in the closest barn or find hunting shelters in the mountains. Shelters? Bree asked. Small huts built under a rock overhang. They have stone walls and a place to see out. High in the mountains, men have dug deep, narrow pits. When they hunt reindeer, they hide the pits with branches. When the wind blows cold... Rika didn't need to finish. Already Bree had felt the wind coming down the fjord, and it was only October. But from now on, Bree would watch the mountain tops. Maybe she would see a reindeer running free, a reindeer that did not fall into a pit. When they went inside, Bree discovered that Mikhail's word was good. A package wrapped round and round with sealskin lay on a table. When the Ruka took off the layers, she held up a book with a white calfskin cover. Firelight caught the sparkle of the precious gems on the cover. Rika gasped. Brought to the monastery by pilgrims from many lands, the gems had great value. Hand-copied by Brother Cronin, a monk at the Glendalough Monastery, the book contained the 4 Gospels. Rika traced her hands over the cover, lightly touching each jewel. "What do we do with it?" she asked. "I want to help grandmother sleep." Rika rolled her eyeballs. "That's impossible. Her nightmares go on and on." "I know," Bree thought, "for me too, and I want to search for Keely." A slow smile crept into Rika's face. "Well, I guess neither of us has anything to lose." Later that morning, Bree and the grandparents sat down on one of the benches close to the fire. Even in the dark room, the light of the flames caught the precious gems on the calfskin cover. Like Rika, grandmother reached out and lightly touched each gemstone, but then she sat back and waited, as though knowing the real treasure lay inside. Bree carefully opened the pages. Turning the book for grandmother and grandfather to see, Bree pointed out the bright colours and beautiful designs in the hand-drawn letters. To Bree, it seemed that light shone from every page. Again, grandmother reached out. With a careful touch, she traced a beautifully drawn letter and nodded. Once more she sat back, as though waiting. As Bree looked down at the Latin words, she felt like giving up before she started. How can I possibly read a language I'm still trying to learn myself? She also needed to translate the words into the Norse language so that the grandparents could understand. Bree didn't know whether the trade language she had learned from her father used all the same words as the people on the Outlaw fjord. But then, as she asked God for help, he showed her what to do. Brother Cronin had taught her well, so she could read enough of the words to remember the stories. She could explain the stories in her own words or through promises she had memorized. Bree decided to start with a thought that meant especially much to her right now. "This book tells us about the truth," Bree said. "Jesus said, 'You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.'" At first, Bree found it easiest to not look up from the big book, and then she sensed a quiet movement. As Bree talked, Mikhail's grandmother straightened up. Her shoulders back, she sat erect and strong, but had a faraway look in her eyes. Is she even hearing what I'm saying? Bree wondered. It was a relief to see grandmother sitting quietly instead of moaning in her sleep. But grandfather stared at Bree so intently that she shivered. What is he thinking? Am I doing something wrong? That afternoon, Bree and Rika began weaving the sail for the ship Mikhail would build. Eventually, the many long strips they wove would be sewn together to make the gigantic sail that sent a Viking ship running before the wind. On some days, women helped Rika with her work. On other days, she worked alone. Bree was starting to understand the meaning of the keys on Rika's belt. They seemed to be a symbol of all she must do to manage the farm when the men of the family were at sea. As Bree worked, she kept thinking about Mikhail and his father. How long would they be gone? After her first few nights in the house, Bree had decided on a plan. She would wait until grandmother woke up, help her settle down, and then creep out to search for Keely. But Bree soon learned she could never guess when grandmother would have a nightmare, and if she wasn't there when needed, Rika would know at once. Mikhail had been right. His mother needed help with her work. It surprised Bree that Mikhail had been concerned enough to notice. It showed a kindness in him that Bree didn't expect. But now, after reading comforting words from the big book, Bree felt more hopeful. Hadn't grandmother been helped by her reading? Tonight she would surely sleep better. Instead, Grandmother woke up crying again. As one night after another fell away, Bree grew more and more desperate. How long will this keep on? Soon Mikhail and his father would be back. Without doubt, they would stay in Orland for the winter. When the snows of winter were upon them, how could she possibly search for Keely? As Bree lay awake at night, she felt the barn grow colder. Alone in the stable, she heard the meow of the cats and the quiet movements of the cows. Other times she heard the wind in the eaves and the creak of timbers. And still other times Bree wondered if she heard footsteps outside the barn. Sometimes a dog gave sharp warning and started other dogs barking. Always Bree listened. Would she hear the click of the latch if someone opened the outside door? Working hard all day, awake much of the night, Bree finally was exhausted. Lying on her bed of hay, she stared up at a roof she could not see and decided she had been a slave long enough. "I cannot stand this, Lord," she prayed. "I promised to serve you, but don't you love me? Don't you care what happens to me?" In the dark stable, the horses stamped their hooves. "I hate what I have become," she whispered in her anger. "I'm starting to think like a slave. I'm starting to think I cannot change what is happening to me." Knowing that made her afraid. How can I have the courage to win when I hate every part of my life? Bree pushed back her blanket. "I don't want to be a slave," she declared, without realizing that she had spoken aloud this time. From the darkness below, a cow moved. "I hate being a slave." Again the cow moved. "What's more, I will not be a slave." For the third time the cow moved. Bree sat up. "Be quiet," she ordered. "I'm talking to myself and you're interrupting." In the silence that followed, Bree felt relieved. "Good," she thought. "Someone around here is listening to me." But then she spoke aloud again. "I hate my life. I hate it, hate it, hate it. I'm always serving. No one ever says I'm doing a good job. No one ever even says thanks. They just ask for work. Moo!" The cow gave the longest moo yet. Suddenly, Bree laughed. Throwing aside her blanket, she climbed down the ladder and started towards the shelf where she kept the lamp. When she remembered she had no way to light it, Bree headed for the cow instead. Bree stumbled around in the darkness. When she found the right stall, the cow turned her way. Bree felt the movement with her hands and stroked the cow's neck. "I will call you Molly," Bree told her, "and we two will be friends." And then, standing in the darkness, Bree sensed the small inner voice she knew well. Like a nudge it came, as though she knew words without hearing them with her ears, but with her heart. "How can you be a light if there is no darkness?" the Lord spoke to her. Bree exclaimed, "You remembered. Being here, being a slave, isn't just a terrible mistake? Something that happened because you looked the other way?" Though the barn was so dark that Bree could not even see her own hand, she felt like she was bathed in light. Chapter 9, Daughter of the King. Starting the very next morning, Bree was the one who milked the cow she called Molly. It didn't matter that other people milked the rest of the cows. Bree always milked Molly. And Bree always sang to her. For that was the time when Bree talked to God. "I'm a chieftain's daughter," she told both him and herself. With that proud knowledge, Bree lifted her head. No, she decided, I'm more than that. I'm the daughter of a king, the king who created the heavens and the earth and the entire world, including this cold, dark land of the north. Yet there was something Bree was learning. She could feel good about herself when everything went right, when she had family, friends and neighbours who loved her, but she didn't have those people anymore. So what do I do, God? What do I become? In the quiet of the stable, Bree waited, and then as she milked Molly, Bree knew, I become a person who respects myself, not because everything is going right, but because I know how God sees me. When Bree went outside, a dusting of snow lay on the top of the mountains. Along the fjord, the brown leaves of an apple tree rustled in the wind. As Bree dipped water from the river, she clutched her cloak around her, but still felt cold. Today there was a thin layer of ice on the fjord. Now, as often before, a young woman came to the river but looked downstream at the fjord. An older woman did the same. People always turned toward the direction where ships sailed in from the sea. Some of the people glanced that way quickly, as if pretending they hadn't looked. Some walked down to the fjord and stared into the blue depths that now looked black with cold. And some stood on the shore as though unable to do anything else. Seeing them, Bree knew that they waited. As she watched them, Bree wondered about her brother Devon. Where is he? Did he get home safely? Has he managed to collect ransom money and begin the trip here? Then, as always, she asked herself, can Dev possibly come before the winter? Later that day, Mikhail, his father, and the other men returned from upriver. While still in the forest, they had begun hewing the wood to the size and shape they needed. Many of them carried long, slender pieces of wood for overlapping planks in the sides of the ship. Others brought heavy pieces for braces or supports. Still others carried the trunk of a very tall tree on their shoulders. Bree felt sure that was the mast, the centre pole that supported the sail. Last of all came Mikhail with the part of a tree where a branch meets the trunk on his shoulder. Naturally strong at the bend, it would become the steering oar of the ship. Because the men used freshly felled timber, it was easier to shape than weathered wood. Watching them, Bree felt surprised by all that Mikhail and the men had already done. True, Sigurd had helped them, but if Bree was honest, she had to admit that Mikhail was a born leader. The next morning he hurried through the mill. It was easy to see that Mikhail and Sigurd were eager to be at their work, and they wanted to use every day before the winds of winter made it more difficult. When Bree took a warm cap to grandfather, she found him with Mikhail. On the flat ground inside the boathouse, the men had started by laying a keel on wooden supports. Next, they bolted stem and stern posts in place. The ship had a double-ended hull with both the bow and the stern built the same way. Mikhail's grin was wide, his face glowing. While aboard the long ship he called Seabird, Mikhail had shown his love of sailing. Other times he talked about seeing faraway places and distant lands and seas. Now this ship would be his even more certainly than the Seabird. Where will you go? Bree asked him when he stopped working for a moment. Mikhail shrugged. Wherever I wish. When the wind blows fair, I'll be gone. Bree felt a knot in her stomach. Not to Ireland, I hope. When Bree was in the barn with the animals, she felt her happiness return. Wouldn't her brother Dev one day come to rescue her? When no one could hear, Bree sang to the cow she secretly called Molly. Of a certainty, Molly must have had relatives in Ireland. Whenever Bree sang in Irish, Molly would turn her head, looking back at the girl who milked her. After one long moo, the cow faced forward, tending to business again. But her milk streamed into the pail as though she liked Bree's company. And the chickens. As the nights grew longer, Bree knew the chickens should stop laying eggs. How could it be that with fewer hours of sunlight they still dropped their eggs into any mound of hay? Often Bree had to search out the eggs to find them before they froze. Whenever she brought them to Mikhail's mother, Rika showed her surprise. But Bree loved the horses best of all. Such horses were fit for a king. Running her hands over their backs, Bree stroked their necks and whispered into their ears. By now the horses recognized her step and greeted her whenever she entered the stable. As Bree brushed the coats that were thick from the cold weather, she ran her hand over their cream-coloured manes with the dark stripe. Both horses felt like new friends. At the same time, Bree grew more and more anxious about the winter that would soon be upon them. Though Bree put in a long day's work, Rika sometimes let her go in the mountains. Then one afternoon she said, "My good friend has a birthday. I want you to bring her a gift." Carefully, Rika wrapped towels around 6 precious eggs. Carefully, she nestled the eggs in a basket with a stout carrying handle, and then, to Bree's great delight, Rika told her to cross the river and follow the path upstream. "But take care," she said. "The way is steep and dangerous. You Irish are used to walking in the mountains, aren't you?" Bree smiled. "When I was just a young girl." "Oh, yes, of course," Rika said. "You are Irish." It had become a joke between them. For Bree too often said, "That's the way we do it in Ireland." Finally, Rika drew back, saying, "I will hear no more about all the things the Irish can do." But now she smiled. Carrying the basket of eggs, Bree set out. The dog Bree secretly called Shadow followed close behind. Wherever she walked, Bree watched for landmarks, ways that she could find her direction if she came that way at night again. The promise between her and Mikhail stood, but if she were ever released from that promise, Bree wanted to have a plan. The farm where Rika's friend lived was nestled in a hollow of the mountains. When Bree drew close, dogs and children ran to meet her. When Bree gave Rika's gift to the woman who lived there, her face shone with gratitude. "For my birthday," she asked, "from my friend Rika. Tell her thanks and thanks and thanks again." That was the day Bree found her Irish friend Lil. When Bree went back outside, Lil followed her to the beginning of the trail. After they hugged each other, Bree stood back looking at the 8-year-old who had become a close friend on the voyage here. "How are you doing?" Bree asked, like an older sister to a younger. I really miss my family, Lil told her, but every time I do, I ask God to fill me with his love, and he does. When Lil smiled, it was as though a light shone behind her eyes. As the woman of the house looked out the door, Lil spoke quickly. Brie, remember how you told me about your sister Keely? Does she have hair the colour of reddish sand, blue eyes, freckles across her nose? Yes, a long braid and a funny tuft of hair at the top of her head. Brie asked. I've seen an Irish girl like that, Lil said, but I don't know where she lives. Then Lil grinned. You know, I still need to get you back to Ireland. My cousin Tully wants to marry you when you grow up. Marry me, Brie thought. All the way home, Brie clutched the thought to herself. On the day Mikhail raided the Irish countryside, her secret dreams for the future had been stolen away. For as long as Brie could remember, Tully had been a friend to both her and Dev. When Brie returned from upriver, she hurried around to the back of the barn. Walking alongside the mountain at the edge of the farm, Brie came to the shore of the fjord. Near the boathouse were small trees that hid Brie from view of the house. Talk of Tully made her lonely for home. In all this time, she still had no idea where to find Keely, and now Brie had to face something more. Whenever Brie saw people waiting for the last ship, her hope died just a little. How could Dev possibly come this late in the season? Worse still, what if he was on a ship that was lost at sea? Then as Brie prayed for the last ship out, she realized something. Wise and good Sigurd reminded her of her own father, a respected Irish chieftain. Kind Rika reminded her of what it meant to be under the care of her own mother. But Mikhail? Mikhail wrecked my life. He destroyed my dreams, she thought. Whenever Brie thought of him, she felt a knot of hurt deep inside. Leaning forward, Brie buried her head in her lap and began to sob. Then in the midst of her sobs, Brie remembered. God had set her free. But her hurt and resentment for what Mikhail had done was so great that she was not willing to set him free. From what seemed like the 100th time she prayed and asked for help to forgive Mikhail, this time she even asked God to bless him. Instantly, Brie wondered why she had ever prayed that. She almost took her prayer back. She could only feel glad that Mikhail wasn't there to hear. Chapter 10, Lost Forever. As Mikhail came out of the boathouse, he caught a glimpse of Brie as she tucked herself down behind trees, further along the fjord. Mikhail stopped, watched and waited. Is Brie hiding until she can slip off over the mountains? Suddenly, Mikhail didn't want Brie to go. The thought surprised him. I don't want to have to search again, he told himself, yet Mikhail knew it was more. He was worried about her safety. Then, from the other side of the trees, he heard sobs. Soft at first, as if she didn't want anyone to hear, and then the heart-wrenching sobs of someone who could no longer hold back the pain that she felt inside. In that moment, Mikhail suddenly wished that Brie would live his life forever. Listening to the sobs that seemed to tear her heart apart, Mikhail knew the truth of his father's word. You're a slave to whatever you serve. And in that terrible moment of truth, Mikhail despised himself. How can I possibly set things right? He couldn't go back to Ireland, not to the Wicklow Mountains where Brie lived. The angry Irishman would kill him for ruining their lives. And Brie's father? Mikhail shuddered just thinking about him. Even if I returned Brie safely, her father has every reason to hate me. Her mother, Brie's mother, will hate me even more. All these months of having Brie gone from their family. For the first time, what he had done seemed real to Mikhail. Until now he had been able to push it aside, but no longer. Brie's angry looks at him, her open hatred for what he had done, had never touched him like this before. Brie's sobs changed all that. They even changed the way he saw his own mother and father. Now, as he watched his mother, father, and all the townspeople wait for the Viking ship to return, Mikhail remembered the day the word came about Ivar. Lost, gone forever. Only now did Mikhail understand that it was the same in any language, any land. People loved their own and always would. By leading a Viking raid, he had torn those families apart. Brie's sobs were quieter now. Oh, she'll get over it, Mikhail tried to console himself. Yet he had to face the truth. Maybe someday Brie would learn to live here, but she would never get over losing her home. She would never be totally free of that heartache that Mikhail himself knew. The lonely ache that came each time he remembered that Ivar was gone forever. As Mikhail stepped back inside the boathouse, he again wished that Brie would slip away over the mountains, just disappear from his life. But then, strangely enough, he didn't want that either. Chapter 11, Dev's Surprise. Still wiping tears from her face, Bree came out from the trees near the fjord. As she started along the sheer rock wall of the mountain, she looked down. Someone had placed small stones on the slanted side of a large boulder. Bree stared at the patterns. One was a straight stick with upper and lower arms. The second pattern was a torch. Another secret message? Bree felt sure that it was. Keely? Could it possibly be? As Bree wondered what the message meant, Mikhail spoke from behind her. Bree jumped. Whirling around, she faced him with a sinking heart. What if the message gives Keely away? With one swift movement, Bree stepped between the small stones and Mikhail, but he was studying her face, and Bree wondered if he could tell that she had been crying. Instead of saying something, he moved around Bree and looked down at the boulder. What's this? Bree shrugged. I don't know. Interesting, he said. This has to be a torch. Mikhail traced his finger around the flame. Maybe someone wants to meet at night? But this? Mikhail pointed to the stick with two arms. It's not one of our runic symbols. Trying to pretend it wasn't important to her, Bree stood back, but her thoughts raced ahead. If it's not a runic symbol, it must be the letter K. Just wondering about the possibilities, Bree felt as if she could leap over the highest mountain. Then she remembered she must hold that secret to herself. She could not let her excitement show in her face. But Mikhail had given her a key as important as the keys Rika carried on her belt. As Mikhail headed for the boathouse, Bree was thinking back. When my sister Keely was taken by the Vikings, how old was she? 6? 7? One thing was certain, Keely hadn't learned to read and write as Bree and Devon have. Does Keely know that in Irish her name starts with the letter K? Possibly. Bree could only guess, but the more she thought about it, the more hopeful she felt. Late that afternoon, when it was time to read to the grandparents, Hawk came to the door. Bree took one look at him and swallowed hard. When Bree first saw Hawk on the Viking voyage, she had been afraid of him. Then as a seabird crossed the dangerous North Sea, Bree had glimpsed him in a different light. But now Hawk had come, ready to argue or to hear for himself. As they sat on the benches near the fire, Bree looked from one to the other and wondered what to do. Grandfather helped her out. Tell Hawk about this man Jesus. Bree started by telling about his birth. Our God loves us so much that he sent his only son as a baby. Because there was no room in an inn, he was born in a stable. His mother laid him in a manger, a feeding trough, a long, narrow box that holds food for animals. Grandmother smiled. A pleased look filled her eyes, but Grandfather's unblinking stare made Bree uncomfortable. The sharp look in his eyes seemed to go straight through her. Whenever Bree explained something, he listened as though testing every word. Hawk asked even more questions than Grandfather. Bree did her best to answer, but she could never tell what Hawk was thinking. Before long, he made her so nervous that Bree stumbled over her words. Finally, she stopped talking. But Hawk motioned to her, Go on, go on. Why is your God so loving? The next time Bree looked up, she caught the hint of a smile in Grandfather's eyes. Bree couldn't figure out what was happening. Then she saw the look in Grandmother's eyes. It started the same way, almost as if someone had turned on a light. As the grandparents glanced at each other, Bree wondered, did I say something strange? Did I use a word the wrong way? She didn't think so, but the grandparents suddenly knew something that she didn't. The next day, when Hawk came in, he paused in the open doorway. In spite of the cold, he stood there for a few minutes, staring at the fjord. Later, after Bree read for a time, Hawk stood up and walked back to the door. Closing the big book, Bree watched him. Again, Hawk gazed at the long, narrow strip of water that led between steep mountains to the sea. Soon the fjord will freeze over, he said. Turning, Hawk came back. Please, I don't know how to pray the way that you do, but will you pray to your God for the ship that is late? When Bree went for water the next morning, the wind carried snow on its breath. During the night, ice had formed in the fjord, and now the tiny clear sheets lay in heaps on the shore. Hurling its way across the open, the wind stirred up waves and left white flecks of foam. Though it was early in the morning, people stood on both sides of the river that emptied into the fjord. Today, not just slaves or servants were there to carry water. Today, landowners waited and watched. Women with a chain of keys at their waist stood quietly. Children stopped their play to look at the fjord. All of them, young or old, gazed in the direction where the long, narrow, watery way led to the sea. Then, soft on the wind, Bree heard it. so soft that at first she thought she imagined it. Moments later, the sound of music drew closer. Lively trills filled the fjord, pushing aside the cold and the fear. Panpipes? The small wind instrument that Bree loved? The high, clear notes echoed against the mountains and leapt into Bree's heart. Pipes, she wondered again? Pipes on a Norwegian fjord? Could it possibly be? Pipes belonged to Ireland. Bagpipes belonged to... Then Bree heard it, the sweet, clear notes of an Irish lullaby, and then Bree knew. Dropping her buckets of water, Bree caught up her skirt and raced along the river to the fjord. A moment later, a Viking ship rounded the bend in the rock walls of the waterway. By the time Bree reached the edge of the fjord, whoever was playing the bagpipes had stopped, but Bree had no problem spotting her brother. Always, Bree had been sure that he would be the one to rescue her. As the Viking ship drew close to shore, Devon stood at the bow. As though a wave of the sea surged forward, people surrounded the ship, calling shouts of welcome. Near at hand, a young woman held up a child. When a man on board waved to him, the boy leaned forward, wanting to be held. Moments later, the ramp went out. One Viking sailor after another picked up his sea chest, balanced it on his shoulder, and hurried off the ship. And then, carrying only a cloth bag filled with all he owned, Devon stood in front of Bree. Like their father, Devon had the black hair and deep blue eyes of the dark Irish. Now his eyes seemed lit with excitement, and his laugh, Dev was so glad to find it that his laugh tumbled out of him. Looking at him, Bree forgot everything else. Dev, I can't believe it's you. Reaching out, Devon gave her a warm brotherly hug, then kissed her cheeks 3 times. When he stood back, he took Bree's hands and looked her in the eye. Are you all right? He asked. Now that you're here, I'm perfect. As Bree opened her arms, he gave her another hug. Bree was so overwhelmed that she began weeping. Clearly embarrassed, Devon patted her back. Oh, there, little Bree. Everything's all right now. Not since she was very young had he called her that. At the sound of it, Bree stopped crying, as she always had. Devon reached into the bag he had set on the ground. Bree took one look at the handkerchief he held out and backed away. Even at a glance, Bree knew she wanted no part in blowing her nose in it. Devon laughed and Bree laughed with him. Never in her life had she been so happy to see anyone. But there was something new about her brother. In the time since Bree had seen him, he seemed to have grown taller. Is that it? Bree wondered. And then she realized it was something else. The hardship that had fallen on the family because of Mikhail's raid had aged Devon. But was it more? Mom, Daddy, how are they? Suddenly Bree felt afraid for them. Except for missing you and Keely, they're fine. Mom says that when she prays, she has peace about you. Peace, Bree thought. Her mother actually had peace when she knew almost nothing about what happened to her. And then Bree remembered something. God had given her peace too. Strange. How did both of them know peace in spite of all that had happened? How's Adam? Bree asked about her 7-year-old brother. He took care of Kara and Jen until Daddy got to the hiding place and took all of them home. Filled with relief, Bree smiled. And that awful day when the Vikings came, what was it you told Adam? That if he could care for 2 little girls, he could be an Irish chieftain one day. Bree's laughter filled the crisp air. Oh, Dev, it's so good to see you. And I have another surprise. Dev leaned forward to whisper in her ear. Don't say a word, but I have a ransom of money with me. Ransom money? Bree drew back, checked his eyes to be sure her brother wasn't teasing. She felt sure that rescuing her from Mikhail's clutches would take a good deal of money. How could Dev possibly have collected that much money already? But her brother put a finger across his lips as though saying, shh. Whatever questions Bree had, they would have to wait. Already Devon was looking around. When he found the man who appeared to be the leader of the Viking crew, Devon led Bree over. This is Ingmar, the man who gave me safe passage from Ireland. He's a trusted friend of a shoemaker in Dublin. Bjorn the cobbler said I would be safe with him. When Bree looked up into Ingmar's face, she felt stunned by the look she saw there. This was no young man who chose to go a Viking because he wanted to raid the Irish countryside. The kindness in Ingmar's eyes reminded her of Sigurd. Ingmar? My sister Bree, Devon said. So quickly I have found her. I cannot thank you enough for giving me safe passage here. Ingmar grinned. And when the wind blows fair, I'll take both of you to Dublin. You'll be free again, he said. Free? Bree hardly dared breathe. I will be free again? Just thinking about having this kind man take her home seemed so overwhelming that Bree felt weak. Then as she saw Mikhail taking long strides their way, she felt angry. So, who do we have here? Mikhail asked, looking at Devon. My passenger, Ingmar answered. Your passenger? Mikhail scoffed. He shook his head. You're wrong there. I promised him safe journey to the Outlaw ford. Instinctively, Devon stepped over next to Ingmar. He pulled Bree alongside. Then you gave a promise you cannot keep. Devon is my prisoner. Your prisoner? Yes, my prisoner. My men took captive of him during the raid at Glendalough. Ingmar turned to Devon. Is that true? You didn't tell me that. But Mikhail set him free, Bree said quickly. Mikhail even said to him, go while you have the chance. And you went? Ingmar asked. A still cold look had settled over Devon's face. Seeing it, Bree felt afraid. Dev raced up the hillside, she said quickly. Mikhail watched him go. Is that true? Ingmar demanded of Mikhail. In a weak moment, Bree remembered the moment clearly. How could she ever forget? She had asked Mikhail, how many graves do you have in your family cemetery? In that instant, Bree had known something had shattered Mikhail's life. Seeing the expression on his face, she had pressed for Devon's freedom, and Dev won. But Mikhail no longer appeared upset by the death of his brother. His face was cold and hard, his eyes angry and unwilling to give. So you brought ransom money for Bree? Devon met his gaze, but his eyes held no answer for Mikhail. Mikhail's scoffing laugh broke the silence. Of course you brought ransom money for Bree. Why else would you come? Still Devon held his gaze. His blue eyes looked long and hard at Mikhail, but Bree could not see beyond the thoughtful look in her brother's face. She had seen that look before, a look of firm purpose to meet whatever Mikhail decided to do. But Bree also knew something else, that behind that unflinching gaze, those blue eyes that would not give away, Devon was praying. And in that moment, Bree remembered. With 2 quick steps, Bree moved from Devon's side to where her brother could see her without looking from Mikhail. In the next moment, Bree crossed her arms in the signal she and Devon had used since they were children. Courage to win, Dev, Bree was saying without words. Jesus gives us the courage to win. For one instant, Devon's eyes flickered her way. When Devon also crossed his arms across his chest, it looked as though he had taken a battle stand. Mikhail looked from Devon to Ingmar. He was my prisoner. He is my prisoner again. No, Ingmar declared. You set him free, and he remains free. When the wind blows fair, I'll take both of them back to Ireland. By now the crowd that gathered seemed to have drawn a line in the sand. On one side stood Ingmar and the men coming off his ship. On the other side were men from Mikhail's ship. Devon stood in the middle of that line. So, Mikhail told him, you do have ransom money? Even Ingmar is not foolish enough to think I would let Bree go without it. Reaching out, Mikhail grabbed Devon's bag and began opening it, but Devon was angry now. As he snatched the bag from Mikhail, it split and a bag of coins fell out. Before Devon could catch it, Mikhail grabbed the bag and held it high. Mine, he declared. No, mine, Devon answered, reaching for it. But Mikhail swung around and held the bag behind his back, and his men drew close as if protecting him. As their angry mutters grew, Bree heard their words. The boy is our prisoner, all right. We took him captive. Why should he go free? Bree clenched her hands. The frightened emptiness in her stomach changed to a knot of fear that told her something even worse was coming. Behind Ingmar, his men were muttering too. Without doubt, they had grown to like Devon on the voyage here. But if it came to a bag filled with coins, where would their allegiance stand? The money is not yours, Ingmar said to Mikhail, nor is it Devon's. He brought a ransom to set Bree free. Mikhail glared at him. With one swift movement, he pulled his sword from his belt. I know how to settle this. Chapter 12, Bree's biggest fear. Ingmar shook his head. We are blood cousins, Mikhail. We will not let a question of money destroy our family. Go, Ingmar said to the man who stood behind him. Get Sigurd, our chieftain will settle this matter. No, declared Mikhail, as though knowing what his father would say. The Ting will settle this matter. But that doesn't meet until spring. Mikhail's hard laugh seemed to echo along the waters of the fjord. Until then, Devon can rot in jail, and I will hold the ransom money. No! With long strides, Sigurd reached the people standing on the shore. The authority Bree had often heard in his voice was even stronger now. Who is this? Sigurd asked, looking at Devon. Bree's brother Devon, Mikhail answered, his voice angry but respectful. I promised him safe passage, Ingmar said quickly. He brings a ransom? Sigurd asked. Ingmar nodded. As Sigurd looked from Ingmar to Mikhail, Bree knew that Sigurd would allow no argument. I will hold the ransom money, he declared. No one will take even one coin from this bag. When spring comes upon the land and our ting meets again, we will decide. We will hear each free man who wants to speak, and when we cast our vote, we will decide whether a person who brings ransom can become a captive himself. His body stiff and straight with anger, Mikhail stepped back. But Bree felt afraid, first for her brother Devon, then for what Mikhail might do. Bree also saw the anger in Ingmar's eyes. He had given a promise, and that promise had been taken from him. Now, Sigurd looked first at Ingmar, then at Mikhail. Both of you go with Devon. Take him to the jail. Tell the jailer I have ordered his safekeeping. Reaching out, Mikhail twisted Devon's arm behind his back. Watching Mikhail, Bree felt angry again. Then she felt sick. But when she tried to follow Devon, Mikhail and Ingmar, Sigurd stopped her. Go to the house, he said. When Sigurd entered the longhouse that evening, Bree hurried to the door. She bowed her head in respect, but her voice was strong when she spoke. Why did you put my brother in jail? You know he's done nothing wrong. I put him there for safekeeping, Sigurd answered, for his own safety. And Mikhail's, Bree was determined to bring the real problem out in the open. But Sigurd met her honestly. And Mikhail's, I will do what I can so that blood does not flow in our family. In that moment, Sigurd suddenly seemed old, but his steady blue eyes held a look that Bree knew from her own father. No one would change Sigurd's mind. When Bree visited Devon the first time, she found the jail easily because she had heard him playing the pipes. A set of pipes bound together, the wind instrument was straight across the top and slanted from a shorter to a longer side at the bottom. Why was your ship so late? Bree asked Devon. Oh, we had many storms. Storms? Not one, but many? Yes, in the North Sea. What did you do? She asked. Pray like I've never prayed for anything in my life, except when I prayed for you, that is. Bree knew what that was like. Mikhail's ship had also met a storm in the North Sea. But then Bree looked around. The jail cell in which Devon lived was small and dark, lit only by one oil lamp. Partway below ground it was also damp and so cold that Bree shivered even with her cloak on. It's so dirty here, she said. Dirt she could see in spite of the poor light. Devon shrugged as though it wasn't important. Ask the jailer for a pail of water. I'll scrub it myself. No, Devon said. I'll scrub it after you're gone. Bree held her nose. But it stinks. It's a hole in the ground. It's cold and it's dark. It's all that. But please, Bree, just sit down. Bevan offered her a wobbly three-legged stool, but it was better than the dirt floor on which he sat. His legs crossed, he made himself comfortable and said, I just want to look at you. I want to believe that you're really here. And Bree smiled. She too could not stop looking at her brother. I don't know if I'd ever see you again, she whispered. I still can't believe I found you. Now that you're here, now that I know that Mum and Daddy, Adam, Kara and Jen are all safe, Bree broke off. Again, she realised that Dev had changed since she last saw him. It was as though he had grown used to looking far across the sea. Had the pain of separation from her and the rest of the family given him that long, steady look? Then this brother, who always watched out for her, asked her, Bree, how are you doing? His question brought tears to her eyes, and his hug warmed her heart. Courage to win, Dev, she said, when she could speak again. Courage to win, Bree. Jesus, our Lord, is Saviour and King. For a moment longer he looked at her, then cleared his throat. Bree? The ransom money? Already Bree had started to hate that money. What if the Vikings didn't give it back? What if she had to stay here forever? Even the very poorest people in the Wicklow Mountains gave something so that we would have enough for you to come back. People traded honey or sheep or anything they had so they could set you free. Free, Bree said. The words seemed to echo between them. Free, Devon's answer bounced against the stone walls, flung itself around the room. Free. Bree's biggest fear was that she would never be free again. That the Vikings would leave her brother to rot in jail, never to see the light of day again. That Keely would never be returned to their family. And then Bree remembered. I believe I've seen Keely, she said to Devon. The next morning, when Mikhail left to work on his ship, Bree followed him outside. He was still angry with her, and she with him. After all he had done to Devon, Bree wanted to never look upon Mikhail's face again. But there was something she needed to know. According to your religion, she began, what happens when you die? Mikhail didn't like the question, she could tell, but then he said, I'll go to Valhalla, a large hall where heroic warriors go. A young maiden will come and take me there to feast and to fight. But you're no heroic warrior. Not yet, Mikhail admitted, but I will be by the time I die. As always, Bree hated his prideful look. What makes you so sure, she said. Mikhail grinned. What makes you think I won't be? Bree had no answer for that, but she still didn't know what would help her with grandmother. What about people who are sick or old, like your grandmother? Well, there's a different place for her. Mikhail's voice sounded careless, as though it didn't even matter since it wasn't his final destination. It's twilight there, half day and half night. It's a cold place with freezing fog. Is it a place where you would want to go? Bree asked. Even Mama says she doesn't want to go there. And your father, where will he go? To a place where wise and just leaders go. Wouldn't you rather all be together, though? Bree asked. Mikhail stared at her. Why do you always ask such strange questions? Bree stared back, thinking, why did it take me so long to figure this out? Later that morning, Bree, grandmother, grandfather and Hawk again gathered around the fire. As always, Rika worked nearby. Grandmother was the first to ask a question. Where does your God send people when they die? Oh, Bree almost said it aloud. The dark, freezing fogs, she thought. From the pain of being alone, Bree knew what to tell her. Grandmother, do you like to be where people love you? When we die, we will go to be with someone who loves us forever, when he returns. Suddenly, grandmother became still, waiting to hear more as if Bree's answer was a matter of life or death. Would you like to be free of what makes you so afraid? Bree asked gently. When Jesus grew up, he died on the cross for you. If you ask him to forgive the wrong things that you do, he will forgive you. And if you ask him to be your savior, he is. But what is his house like? Grandmother asked. It's a big house with many rooms. Jesus said he was going to get it ready for us. That's good, Grandma asked. It's very good. There will be no death there, no sadness or tears. We'll be clothed in white. Clothed in white? Grandmother looked around the room that was always partly dark. I think I'd like that. Best of all, we'll be with Jesus. He promised to come get us so we can be where he is. Do you want to know more about him? Thank you, I would, Grandmother said. When they finished talking, Grandmother asked, Please, can I have the big book in my room at night? Sure, I'll build a shelf for you, Grandfather promised. I'll put the shelf next to your bed. That night, no sound disturbed Bree's sleep. When she woke somewhere near dawn, Bree was sure she had slept through Grandmother's moans. How come I didn't hear her cry? Suddenly, Bree felt afraid. Had something happened to her? Had she died? Quickly, Bree crawled down the ladder, crept through the hallway, and slipped into Grandmother's room. The blankets were in place. Grandmother slept quietly, but one hand reached out from beneath the warm wool blankets. On the shelf next to her, the big book lay open, though Grandmother could not read what it said. Her hand rested on the words of Jesus in the book of John. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. In the light of the oil lamps, Bree saw Grandmother's look of peace. After the early morning meal, Bree again carried scraps of food to the dogs. Whenever she appeared at the door, bowl in hand, they came running. Kneeling down, Bree scratched behind Shadow's ears. When no one could hear, she always spoke to him in Irish. For the first time, Shadow turned his head and licked her wrist. Ah, you really are my friend now, Bree said. You're not just looking for food. His woof was all the yes she needed. Though Molly no longer gave milk, Bree still talked to the cow every day. Often Bree told Molly how glad she was for the calf that would be born in the spring. As Bree finished her chores outside the barn, the horse she had named Flurry followed close behind her. Like a small child, Flurry was curious about everything Bree did. Sometimes Bree felt she was a pest, other times Bree loved it. She still felt the surprise of the light-coloured mane with the dark stripe that ran down Flurry's back into its tail. Reaching out, Bree stroked the mare's strong neck. Thick and powerful, it gave Flurry a proud look, one that seemed to fit this land of fjords and mountains. Shadow and Flurry had become friends. One afternoon, when Bree set out to visit Devon, the dog followed her. Behind Shadow came Flurry. Go back, Bree told both of them, but Flurry walked up behind her and snuffled her nose in Bree's neck. I'm here, the mare seemed to say. Don't forget me. By now, the sprinkling of snow that lay upon the mountains each morning no longer melted during the day. Instead, snow left a white blanket even on the stones in the river. Near the water lay the house of the jailkeeper. Unlocking the door, he let Bree into Devon's cell. The minute he was sure the jailer was gone, Devon exclaimed, "I saw her! I saw her! I saw her!" Chapter 13, Hack Silver. "You saw Keely?" Bree couldn't think of anyone else who would make Dev that excited. "She heard me playing the pipes she rapped on the small door for passing food. She actually let you see her?" Devon's grin stretched from ear to ear. "When I heard her knock, I was afraid. It was the dead of night." "You thought someone came to hurt you?" Devon nodded. "I wondered about it. I waited, but then..." Bree leaned closer. Devon laughed with the fun of it. "Remember how Keely used to make all those funny sounds?" "Yes," Bree laughed as she remembered Keely's strange collections of sounds. "Which one, though?" "The one she used when she was really tired, remember?" Bree laughed with him. "She meowed like a cat. It was so real I couldn't tell the difference. She had a whole range of cat noises, a meek little kitten, a howling tomcat." "Well, when she was really tired," Devon prompted, "remember? Which one?" "The little kitten, like a newborn kitten meowing for its mother." Devon laughed again. 6 years it's been. 6 years! I heard that meow and I opened the door last night." "You could see her?" She put her head down close, her face right into the opening. "How did she look?" "Bree, she's the Keely we knew when she was 6 years old. I was afraid. We were all afraid." Keely pushed her hand through and took mine. She shook it solemnly and said, "Master Devon, God bless you, Master Dev." As Bree reached out, offering her own hand, Devon's tears fell upon it. "She wanted to hear all the news," he said. "I told her about Mom and Daddy. I told her how we prayed for her day after day, year after year. But when I started to tell about Adam," Devon's voice broke off. "Someone came," Bree said. "I think Keely comes near me at night too, and she doesn't let me see her. One minute she was there, the next she was gone. Like the morning mist in the mountains, she was gone." Bree tried to comfort him. "But you saw her for a moment. You talked with her." "It was like the sun coming out," Devon said. "Oh, I wish I had been here." Bree ached with the loneliness of it. For Devon's sake, she tried to hold back her tears. "I wish I'd seen her too." Then Bree could no longer hold back her tears. As she started to sob, she could not be comforted. Devon tightened his hand on hers. "You will see her, Bree. You will talk with her." Then he, too, was sobbing. When he spoke again, his voice was muffled. "When we hug each other, it will not be a wall between. It will be one big Irish hug." Standing up, Devon opened the small door and looked out to see whether the jailer was nearby. When he sat down on the dirt floor again, he lowered his voice even more. "Bree, are they searching you? Are they through searching you?" Bree sighed. "I think so. They know I came off the ship with nothing but the clothes on my back." "You have places where you can hide something?" Devon asked. Bree nodded. "There were all kinds of hiding places in the stable. But why? What have you got?" Devon knelt down and pried loose the blackened stone in the ground where logs for the fire were kept. From a small hollow beneath the stone, he took out pieces of silver. Hack silver! Bree couldn't believe it. Often used for barter, silver pieces were cut from larger pieces such as silver vessels or jewelry. Viking raiders shared loot among themselves by hacking up their plunder. Pieces of silver were weighed to give a common exchange. "Where did you get this hack silver?" Bree asked. "I kept it separate from the ransom money," Devon said, "just in case." "You got ransom money plus silver from the people of Wicklow?" In spite of their love for her, Bree couldn't imagine how they were able to give so much. Most of the pieces of silver were small, but one piece was large and beautiful. There was also a thin silver wire looped in a circle. It all came from Bjorn, the cobbler in Dublin, the man who made arrangements for my trip here. He didn't want me travelling with empty pockets. He made special shoes for me. Bending down, Devon showed Bree how Bjorn had sewn a hiding place into the top side of each shoe. The secret pocket folded in near where the leather drawstring closed around Devon's ankle. Opening a shoe again, Devon slid the thin loop of wire and some small pieces of hack silver inside, then took them out again. Bree picked up the largest piece of silver. "Wouldn't it be safer with you?" "I don't think so," Devon said. "Take all of it. Hide it well. If you ever need something, you've got it." Bree studied his face, trying to guess his thoughts. "I don't want to leave without you." Devon grinned. "And I won't leave without you, and neither of us can leave without Keely. It's getting more and more complicated now, isn't it? But Bree was thinking about God's provision for their need. It's like we have new friends around the world, she said. And God is the best friend of all. Our invisible, always with us friend, Bree said softly. On her way back to the longhouse, she thought about Grandmother. Bree felt excited about the new peace that Grandmother had. After all her bad dreams, she finally slept well all night. As Bree started across the field, she looked up at the sheer rock wall of the mountain on the far side of the farm. Pine trees grew at the top. If someone looked out between those trees, she would be able to see the fjord, the Ardland River, and the mountains beyond. That person could see the entire Ardland Valley, including the farm where Mikhail and his family lived. Now, Bree wondered, does Keely ever come to that high spot? Does she look down on us and see what I'm doing? It gave Bree a warm feeling, as if Keely were with her even when Bree couldn't see her, yet it bothered Bree too. If Keely knows where I live, why doesn't she find me? I'm her sister. Doesn't she want to talk to me too? As soon as Bree reached the barn, she found a hiding place. Carefully, she tucked Dev's treasure into a crack in the wall to where she slept. Whenever Bree thought about the silver, she wondered how to best use it. And now she felt excited. With Grandmother sleeping well, she could go out and search for Keely. But that night, the winds of winter howled down the fjord. The storm and the snows that came with it kept Bree close to the longhouse. Most difficult of all was knowing that Keely had to be somewhere nearby, close enough to walk, yet too far to make her way through the snow. When Bree went to the river for water, a layer of ice had formed around the rocks. Bree used a bucket to break an opening and dip the water out. The next day, the ice extended further into the stream. Then both the fjord and the river were completely frozen over. Rika told Bree not to mind. The men would haul all the water for both people and animals. They would carry it in barrels from a spring some distance away. The work was heavy, too heavy for a girl. But Bree did mind. Her walks to the river had given her a few moments of freedom each day. During her first weeks in Ardland, she had watched the gold light of morning touch the mountains and reach into the valley on both sides of the river. In those moments, she remembered God's promises to her. Though other people saw her as a slave, she was the daughter of a king. Soon, Rika said that more snow had already fallen than they sometimes had for an entire winter. The people who lived close to each other were joined by pathways through the snow. Bree followed those paths to the jailhouse, and then she heard Dev coughing. At first, Devon brushed aside Bree's concern about his cough. Then he could no longer hide it. When he started coughing, he could not stop. With each cough, Bree grew more upset. Stalking away from the jail, she searched for Mikhail. She found him down by the fjord working on his ship. "You've got to get my brother out of there," Bree stormed as she walked into the boathouse. "Out of jail?" Mikhail's voice was hard. "It's cold, it's damp, it stinks. Devon will die in that hole." Chapter 14, A Matter of Trust. Mikhail stood next to his longship. Chips of wood lay on the ground and shelves held the tools of his trade. Deep inside, Mikhail felt scared for Devon, but he shrugged and let his voice sound careless. "Well, if Devon dies, he dies." Anger filled Bree's face. "How can you be so cruel? It's your fault that he's there." "No," Mikhail said. "It's Devon's fault that he's there. I let him go and he walked back into the trap. Who else in the whole earth would be foolish enough to do that?" "It's not foolishness," Bree said. "Not if you love someone." Tears welled up in her eyes. Quickly she blinked them away, but a tear slid down her cheek. "My brother loves me." If there was anything Mikhail hated, it was watching Bree cry. Most of the time she managed herself better than that. He would rather see her anger spill over with every word. Though he didn't like it, Mikhail had grown used to that. Now he put down the axe he had picked up just before Bree came. Usually his hands were steady. From the time Mikhail was very young, he had used an axe. By now he was proud of his work. Watching Bree cry upset him though. One slip, because she was here, and he could spoil the boards he had worked so hard to make perfect. "My brother works with my daddy," Bree went on, and her voice was steady again. "Oh, Devon is a good shipbuilder?" he asked. "He's good with his hands," Bree said. "He could be your blacksmith, make rivets and—" Mikhail looked down at the ship he was building. He too had worked with his father since he was old enough to handle tools. By now he knew shipbuilding well. He and his men were overlapping the long wedge-shaped pieces of wood used in a clinker-built ship. Bree was smart enough to know what he needed. Countless rivets to hold those boards together. Each of those rivets had to be made by a blacksmith. Looking up, Mikhail saw Bree watching him. You and Devon think of nothing but running away. You don't let yourself like it here. As though surprised that he understood, Bree stared at him. Well, that's true, she said softly. We think of nothing but being together. We're a family, Mikhail. We will always hope that we can be a family again. Like a sword piercing his soul, Mikhail felt the hurt of it. As Bree waited for his answer, Mikhail's father and brother entered the boathouse. You want Devon to work for you? Sigurd asked Mikhail, clearly puzzled by the turn of events. First you capture him, then you set him free, then you force me to jail him for his own protection, and if he works for you, how will you treat him? With fairness, of course, father, said Mikhail. There's something I don't understand, Sigurd said, turning to Bree. How does your brother feel about working for my son? Well, said Bree, I haven't exactly asked him yet. So this is your plan and Mikhail's? Why? My brother is coughing and I don't want him to die in that dungeon. And he will be better off in the cold working in a blacksmith shop? Father asked. My mum is known as a woman with healing in her hands. Mum knows that cough and she says it can become the cough of someone who wastes away and dies. What else does your mother say? Sigurd asked. That someone who coughs like that should get fresh air. People in the Wicklow Mountains respect Mum's words, and so do I. And you, Bree, Sigurd said. Are you also known as a healer? Oh no, not me, Bree exclaimed. Only God heals. I just watched my mother. That's the way we do it in Ireland. Mikhail, Sigurd asked, can you keep that temper of yours under control? A spark of anger lit Mikhail's insides, but then he forced himself to let it go. Yes, he said, respect in his voice, I will keep my anger under control. As Sigurd searched his face, Mikhail met his gaze. Whatever Sigurd saw there, he seemed pleased, and Mikhail felt relieved. Each night, Devon must return to the jail, Sigurd said, but tell the jailer to keep him in his house instead of that hole he calls a cell. Tell him to feed Devon well and give him enough blankets to keep him warm. When Mikhail and Bree set off to see Devon, they walked across the snow-covered ground in silence. Mikhail knew Bree was still upset with him. It wasn't hard to guess that Bree was afraid to speak. Mikhail could see questions all over her face. She's wondering about me, he thought. She's wondering if I'll change my mind in spite of what I said to my father. But Mikhail had his own questions. Will Devon be willing to work for me? Your brother Devon, Mikhail said. Will he promise not to run away? Inside her mittens, Bree's fists clenched as though the pain of her own promise struck her a new blow. When she unknotted them and nodded slightly, Mikhail knew she was saying yes. Dev will hate the promise as much as I do, she said, but you must take care of him or you'll lose a good worker to the grave that you fear. As though she had struck him, Mikhail stepped back. How did she know? Sometimes it seemed Bree could see right inside of him to the feelings he wanted to hide. I'll take care of him, Mikhail said, but only if he takes care of himself. When the jailer opened his door, Mikhail spoke to him. My father says I'm to speak to your prisoner if he is willing to work for me during the day. The jailer keeper nodded. I am to release him to your care, and I will see that he is returned to you each night. Going out ahead of them, the jailer knocked on the small door used to give Devon food. Devon opened the door at once, and when he glanced through the opening, his eyes widened at the sight of Mikhail. My father Sigurd, the mighty chieftain of the Ordeland Fjord, has a question for you, Mikhail said solemnly. Would you choose to work for me during the day? Devon glanced at Bree. Barely moving her head, she nodded. Yes, Devon said. Would you promise to not run away? Again, Devon glanced towards Bree. I promise to not run away during the hours I work for you. But Mikhail caught the change in words. How foolish do you think I am? I'm asking you to make a promise because I know your sister keeps her promises. Do you? Devon grinned. If I make them, that is. Mikhail did not think it was funny. The promise is this. You will not run away. You will not try to escape. I will be able to trust you to do good work, and you will wait in Ordeland for the Ting, the Assembly of Freemen, to make its decision. Watching, Mikhail saw Devon swallow hard. He too took a promise seriously. It was just as hard for him as it had been for Bree. Mikhail thought about it. He knew the Ting well enough to know that their decisions were just and fair. But Devon didn't. He had no idea what awaited him. I need time to think about it, Devon said. Dev? No, Bree. I have to think about this. As Bree sighed, Mikhail saw her face. Clearly she was unhappy now. No doubt she wondered if he and his father would change their minds, giving Devon no second chance. Slowly, Bree wrapped her scarf around her head. "Courage to win, Dev," she said, reaching her hand through the small opening. When she and the jailer left, Mikhail stayed with Devon. "You do not trust me, do you?" Mikhail said. His head bowed. Devon only nodded. "I want to earn your trust," Mikhail said quietly. "Earn my trust?" Dev replied through the small opening. He looked up, searching Mikhail's face. "How can you possibly earn my trust?" "My father is a just and fair man. I want to learn to be wise the way my father is. And you want to practice on me?" Dev's voice was bitter. Mikhail's voice was steady. "I will practice on you." Like Bree, he reached his hand through the opening, but Devon did not take it. His hand still extended. Mikhail waited. Devon looked away, then finally said, "I have to think." "Think?" Mikhail stared at him. "Don't you know you have no other choice?" Mikhail had seen what happened to people who coughed for a long time and kept growing weaker, and it frightened him. The worst of it was that he liked Bree's brother, yet from the moment they met, they had been enemies. As Mikhail turned to go, Devon spoke quickly. "Please, can Bree come and see me tomorrow?" Mikhail nodded, but turned quickly away. When he caught up to Bree, he said, "Your brother wants to see you tomorrow alone." Bree smiled her relief. "Without you listening," she said. Mikhail shook his head. Sometimes he resented her honesty. Other times he felt wonder. "You Irish," she said out loud. "You have nothing going for you, but you think you hold the world." Bree lifted her chin. "That is because we do." On the way back to the longhouse, she asked Mikhail what Devon said. Unwilling to tell her more, Mikhail spat out 4 words. "We talked about trust." Chapter 15, A Place Apart. Trust. As Bree walked to see Devon the next day, she thought about it. Before meeting Mikhail, she had taken trust for granted. Since coming to know him, she had asked herself countless times, "Can I trust what Mikhail says?" For as long as Bree could remember, she had known that she could trust her brother Devon, her father, her mother, their closest neighbours and friends. Bree had also known she could trust Tully, the special friend she thought she had rescued that day in Ireland. But then the person she thought was Tully proved to be Mikhail. Trust. As Bree walked across the frozen ground, she felt the cold rising from the ice. Trust, once again, broken. Everything froze, like chunks of ice between people. Mikhail had broken trust with the Viking raid. He had broken the trust Devon had placed in the man who promised safe passage. Mikhail had even broken trust by taking the ransom money and acting in a way that sent Devon into jail. But deep inside, Bree felt sure that Mikhail was still hiding something even worse from his father. What does Dev know that I don't know? When Bree reached the jailhouse, the jailkeeper let her inside Devon's cell. As Bree sat down on the 3-legged stool, Devon cracked open the small door in the wall. Together they waited until the sound of the jailer's footsteps faded away. Then Devon spoke quickly. "I saw your face last night. I listened to your plan to get me out of here during the day. It's a good one, and my cough isn't nearly as bad as you think. But I'm afraid to work for Mikhail." "You think he'll hurt you?" Bree said. Devon shook his head. "Not while his father is around. No slip tool, no accident. I'll be careful of it, but I don't think so. What I'm really afraid of is myself. And what I know." "You mean about Mikhail?" Bree watched her brother's eyes. Devon knew people. He sensed truth, and he sensed when it wasn't there. "When I was in Dublin, I met a shoemaker named Bjorn. He is a good and kind Norwegian. He came from the Arland fjord, and his best friend here is Mikhail's father, Sigurd. Mikhail brought him trade goods. Bjorn paid him with silver and the shoes that Sigurd wanted to buy. And then..." Devon shook his head, as if even yet he didn't want to believe what had happened. "And then what?" Bree asked. "Mikhail stole a bag of valuable silver coins." Bree stared at Devon. "Mikhail traded with his father's best friend, then stole from him?" Devon nodded. "And now Mikhail asks me to trust him. I want to be worthy of trust, he says." "I knew it. I knew it. I knew it," Bree said. "You knew what?" "That Mikhail has been hiding something from his father, something that it would upset his father even more than the raid on Glendalough." Bjorn the shoemaker hated the raid. He hated what Mikhail had done. He knew it would displease Mikhail's father. "Bjorn is the one who arranged for my safe passage." "The bag of silver coins. I've seen it," Bree said. "Mikhail had 3 bags of coins. I saw him give only one to his father." "And the other 2 bags?" Bree thought about it. One must be treasure he stole from Glendalough, the gifts that pilgrims brought to the monastery, and the other bag? From what you say, it must be the silver coins that belonged to Bjorn. If it is valuable. Before Bjorn became a shoemaker in Dublin, he travelled the world in Viking ships. He saved coins from faraway places. Many of them are Arabic, and Bjorn said, if you can manage to separate Mikhail from my coins and return them to me, I'll give you a reward. Bree stared at her brother. Oh, Dev, you can't say a word. Mikhail will do anything to keep his father from knowing. But what if I forget? Devon asked. You want me to work for Mikhail to get out of this hole? Devon looked around. But what if he makes me really angry? What if I say something that gives away what I know? When Bree's stomach started to churn, she tried to pay no attention. But then, filled with terror, she could only stare at her brother. She felt sure of one thing. If he didn't get out, his cough would get worse. It could even kill him. But if he did leave here to work for Mikhail, what would happen? If Mikhail knows that you know, she said. Suddenly, Bree could no longer ignore her stomach. Standing up, she ran for the door. She barely made it to the nearest snowbank before she was sick with fright. When she returned to Devon's cell, the jailer wouldn't let her back in. The moment he left, Bree went to the small door for passing food. Dev, does anyone besides you know that Mikhail stole from Bjorn? When her brother shook his head, Bree spoke even more softly. Dev, your life is in danger. As Bree walked back to the longhouse, she felt sick at heart too. The more she found out about Mikhail, the more he upset her. At times he was a very likeable person. At other times he made Bree so angry that she could barely handle it. In those terrible moments she knew she had no choice but to forgive Mikhail, but she quite regularly told God, 70 times 7? I have to choose to forgive him that often? I've already lost count. With the wrong between them building up, Bree felt sure she would never come to a place where she could respect Mikhail. During the evening meal, Bree watched grandmother. She was like a different person now, peaceful by day and night. But then Bree noticed Mikhail's brother again. Sitting at one end of a long bench, Cord seemed to set himself apart. Though with the family, he seldom talked. When Rika or Sigurd tried to draw him in, Cord resisted even them. Like a shadow, he stayed around the edges of the family, quiet, silent. Lurking, Bree decided. There, but not really there. Never a real part of the circle. When he wanted, Cord knew how to speak. Why doesn't he take part? Bree wondered. Why do his eyes seem shadowed and far away? But then Bree knew she was mistaken. When Cord looked at Mikhail, his eyes were not shadowed or far away. The fire of resentment burnt there. Now Mikhail turned to Bree. What did Devon say? He hasn't decided yet. Bree turned away. It would take some time to get used to looking at Mikhail again. She didn't know if she could manage knowing what she now knew. Mikhail tried to tease her out of her mood. Tell your brother I'd be a good lad to work for. Huh, lad. That's what Bree called the Irish boys she knew. Bree wouldn't honour Mikhail with that word. She had her own thoughts about someone like Mikhail, and she could speak none of them aloud. Trust? Mikhail asked Deb to trust him? Bree stalked over to the fire and began dishing up food. Tonight they were having pork cooked to perfection by Rika until the scent of it filled the longhouse. But Bree searched through every piece until she found one as tough as the shoes on her feet, and when she dished up Mikhail's portion, that was the piece she gave him. The next morning, Mikhail told Bree, "Go back to Devon, I need a blacksmith." When Bree said no, Mikhail said, "You are a slave. You can't say you won't talk to your brother when I order you to." "That's between you and Devon," Bree told him. "You want me to go and talk to him again?" Bree shrugged as though she didn't care. "How much do you need a blacksmith? Would you rather have a silversmith?" "Like who?" Mikhail sounded careful now. "Like someone who has already begun to learn, an apprentice who knows some of the great silver work, the patterns of Ireland." Mikhail guessed. "Would that silversmith by any chance be you?" "Well," Bree said cautiously, "I was just starting to learn from the silversmith at the monastery. And you just happen to know how to melt coins down and make them into something valuable?" "Well," Bree said again. She didn't want to sound too eager or too skillful, nor did she want to lie. But Mikhail was already running with the idea. "If I did find a silversmith, he could teach you what you don't know. Between the two of you, you could make me a wealthy man." "Yes," Bree answered softly. She did her best to hide her thoughts, but the moment Mikhail was gone, she laughed out loud. It was always Mikhail's greed that won, that and his need to impress others. And maybe I'll find out where you hid that valuable hoard of coins you stole, she thought. Bree never heard now how Mikhail convinced Devon to work for him. She only knew that on days when a storm did not keep everyone inside, Mikhail went to get him. More than once, Bree watched Mikhail and Devon as they crossed the field on a path through the snow. Sometimes they walked together without speaking, other times they talked as if they were friends, and still other times one or both of them looked stiff with anger. On those days, Bree felt afraid. "What do you and Mikhail talk about?" she asked Devon one day. Her brother only grinned. By asking among the Irish slaves, Mikhail soon found a silversmith. Her name was Nice, and his home in Ireland lay close to the sea. In a small building away from the longhouse, Nice set up a crucible for melting down coins. When Mikhail found the right tools, Nice and Bree were ready to work. On the days when Rika had an older woman help with the weaving, Bree worked with Nice. She quickly found he was a gifted silversmith and willing to teach her all he knew. Step by step, Nice showed Bree how to twist ropes of silver into the patterns for which the Irish were famous. As Bree learned from Nice, her plan started to take shape. Alone in the stable at night, she took out pieces of hacked silver. By the light of the oil lamp, she tried to decide what to do with them. How could she turn the silver into something that would be worth even more? Often Bree looked at the small straight pieces in the loop of fine thin wire. The nicest piece of all seemed to be cut from the arc of a circle. Along the outer edge it had a braided design. If the assembly of free men did not return the ransom money to Devon, he needed a way to get out of jail. In order to be free, she would need ransom money, and they also needed to free Keely. Somehow, Bree was going to find a way for all of them to get home. As soon as there was a break in the weather, she'd look for her sister again. If there was a full moon, she could even search at night. When Sigurd came in from a cold winter morning, he walked with a heavy step. Instead of sitting down, he asked the family to go outdoors. As Bree stayed by the fire, he looked back and said, "You too, Bree." Outside, where the light was better, Sigurd said, "I must tell you all something." Standing apart from the rest of them, he held out his right hand. Rika gasped. "Oh no!" Court took one look and backed off. Usually quiet, he surprised Bree by speaking, "Oh, father!" Then it was Mikhail's turn. Moving forward, he too stared at the hand, and when he stepped away, Bree saw tears in his eyes. Neither of the grandparents needed to look, they knew, and so did Bree. She had often heard her mother speak of the disease known as leprosy. It had been present in Ireland from early times. In his travels, had Sigurd somehow come in contact with a leper? "Today, I must separate myself from all of you," Sigurd said. "Today, I must move to a place apart, and there I will wait for my fate." When Rika began crying, she held her hands over her mouth, trying to hide her sobs, but grandmother went to her, put her arms around Rika and held her. Like a small bird hopping from branch to branch, Bree's thoughts scattered in every direction. In Ireland too, this disease afflicted people. There too, it started with small lumps and thickening of the skin, and then as time went on, it infected a finger, toe, hand or foot. "Unclean," Sigurd whispered, as though unable to speak the word aloud. "I am unclean." Then moving back still further from them, Sigurd spoke with the strength that had always marked him. "Take care of each other, my family. Be honest with all people. Be fair." As though thinking of Devon, his gaze rested on Bree. "Court, I will help you from afar, but in all matters of law and business, you are now head of this family." Finally, Sigurd turned to his youngest son. "I'm sorry, Mikhail. When the wind blows fair, you must go alone." Alone! Oh, like a heavy weight, the word dropped among them. For Sigurd would be the most alone of them all. His head bowed, he turned away. His step was slow and sorrowful as he walked to a small building set apart from the rest. Slowly he opened the door, stepped inside, and shut the door behind him. Only then did Rika cry out, "Leprosy! How could such a good man have leprosy?" Chapter 16, Christmas morning. All that day, Bree kept thinking about Sigurd. In the Bible, lepers were expected to call out, "Unclean! Unclean!" and warn people away. It frightened Bree. When it was time for the evening meal, Rika said, "You must feed Sigurd." But I'm afraid, Bree told her. She didn't want to touch Sigurd's dishes. What if I get leprosy? But Rika was also afraid. Well, if I get leprosy, who will care for grandmother? Who will care for the other older women and the children? They all depend on me, Bree. Rika spoke truth. Who could possibly take her place? When the family gathered for their evening meal, Rika caught Mikhail and the grandparents sat quietly. All of them were stunned by Sigurd's bad news. Bree still felt afraid. Then as she served the family, she remembered a story she had learned. Please, Bree asked Rika, can I tell you a story in the Bible? Bree had grown used to talking with Rika and the grandparents, but now she wondered what Mikhail and Court would say. Turning so she didn't have to look at them, Bree spoke to Rika instead. A long time ago, there was a man named Naaman who commanded the armies of his king. But Naaman had a contagious skin disease. Leprosy? Rika barely breathed the dreaded word. But Bree went on. When Naaman's army raided another country, a young girl was taken captive. She became a servant to Naaman's wife. One day the girl said, I wish my master would go see the prophet Elisha. He would heal my master. When Naaman went, Elisha said, Go and wash yourselves 7 times in the Jordan River, and you will be healed of leprosy. And Naaman, was he healed? Grandfather asked. Not at first. Naaman became angry and didn't want to go. He said, I thought the prophet would surely come out to meet me. I expected him to wave his hand over the leprosy and call in the name of the Lord his God. Aren't the 2 rivers of Damascus better than all the rivers of Israel put together? I don't understand, Grandmother said. Bree thought for a moment, wondering what to say. But Rika, Court, Mikhail and the grandparents waited. Finally Bree said, It was as if Naaman asked, Aren't 2 rivers in the Ardeland Fjord better than all the rivers of Ireland? Why do I have to wash in an Irish river? Grandmother nodded her understanding, but a smile lurked in Grandfather's eyes. Naaman was angry, Grandfather said. So he wasn't healed? His officers tried to reason with him, Bree said. They said, If the prophet told you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? So why not obey him when he asked this simple thing to wash and be healed? And what happened? This time it was Mikhail who asked. Naaman dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River. His flesh became healthy. He was healed. Ah! Rika's voice was filled with satisfaction. For the first time that day, she looked as if there might be hope. So who will tell Sigurd the story from the Bible? She asked. Without waiting for an answer, Rika decided what to do. You, Bree, you tell Sigurd the story. But Grandmother looked at Grandfather. Tell Bree, Grandmother said. With a new light in his eyes and a half smile Bree had never seen before, Grandfather leaned forward. A long time ago, a wise man walked through these mountains, he said. We scoffed at the stories he told about Jesus. Why would a God be so loving and kind? But after the man left, we were sorry we laughed. We prayed that if this man spoke truth about Jesus, someone would come and teach us. You came, Bree, Grandmother said. Bree stared at her. I came? You came, Grandfather echoed. As the strangeness of it struck Bree, she felt overwhelmed. Then she felt the wonder of it all. God can use something as terrible as slavery for good? For an instant, Bree glanced at Mikhail and found him watching her. She looked away just as quickly. She couldn't help but wonder about the strange expression in his eyes. If I had listened long ago, my son would have known about your Jesus, Grandfather said. Now I want to be the one to tell Sigurd. The next day, Grandfather stood outside in the snow telling the story of Naaman the leper. Sigurd stood in the doorway of the small building and listened. When Grandfather finished, Sigurd shook his head. No, no! His voice was filled with discouragement. It is just a story. No one is ever healed of leprosy, you know that. But Grandfather didn't give up. In the days that followed, he often stood in the snow talking to his son. At mealtimes, Grandfather bowed his head and thanked God for their food, and he always prayed for Sigurd's healing. When Gina came to the door, she carried a large basket. Standing in front of the loom where it leaned against the wall, Bree did not turn. She only hoped that Gina would not even notice her. As Rika welcomed her, Gina set the basket down on the large flat stones around the fire. I bring you food for strength, food for healing, she said, and I will offer sacrifices to the gods. Rika bowed her head in respect. Thank you, Gina. Our honourable chieftain Sigurd, how is he? The girl asked. The disease on his skin grows, Rika replied. Gina backed away. And you, she asked, is your skin clean? Oh, my skin is clean, Rika's voice sounded calm, but now Bree knew her well enough to guess the turmoil within. You must tell me if it changes, Gina said. Rika nodded. I know. We do not want a plague, Gina pressed. No. It would spread from one man, one woman to the next, from one farm, one... I know, Gina, Rika interrupted. We have taken every precaution. Sigurd lives in a place apart. No one, not even Mikhail nor I, goes close. But food? Who brings his food? Who brings his water? And who carries his dishes away? Her heart in her throat, Bree tried to step deeper into the shadows, but Gina had already noticed her. Bree! It is Bree, isn't it? She is the cause of all your sorrow. She is the one who brings a curse upon your house. No! Rika exclaimed. She is the one who must be cast to the winds, sent into the next storm. No, Rika said again. If she is innocent, she will come back safe. If she is not, no. Rika's usually calm face was flushed with anger. Bree has brought blessing upon my house. Gina stepped back. In her white face, her blue eyes seemed like burning embers. You dare to question what I say? Whirling around, Gina headed for the door. She did not look back. When Gina was gone, Rika sank down on the flat stones around the long heath. Her hands were shaking as she held them out over the embers. Then she put her hands to her face, covering her eyes as Sigurd had the first night Bree was there. For the second time since coming there, Bree saw Rika cry. When finally her sobbing stopped, Bree sat down nearby. Gina hates you, Rika said. Because of the goat? When Bree told about the billy goat, Rika smiled. Oh, it's never good to make fun of someone. Did you and Mikhail do that? We did laugh, Bree said. It just slipped out. Rika thought for a moment. Gina would have laughed about it herself. It would have all come right. Bree understood, as if we shared something between us. But Gina hates you for another reason too. Hawk no longer goes to the sacred grove. When Hawk speaks, people listen, and what he does, other people do. When Bree left for the night, she stopped at the door to the barn and looked back. Rika sat quietly now, but the tears were still wet on her cheeks. Be careful, Bree, she said. Gina is not kind. You must be very careful. Deep in the mound of hay, covered by the warm wool blanket, Bree woke in the middle of the night. First, she heard the creak of timbers, the stamp of a horse in the stall, but then Bree wondered if there was something more. Was that the wind under the eaves, or someone outside again? Barely breathing, Bree listened. Was it the crunch that came when someone walked on very cold snow? Who is it? Who walks there at night? What does it mean? Oh, I'm just imagining things, Bree told herself, but something she couldn't name made her very afraid. For the rest of the night, Bree lay awake. On days when it was too cold to work in the boathouse, the men mended harnesses or tools. Sometimes they played chess in front of the fire. Around them, children gathered to play their own games and keep warm, and always the women sewed or mended or worked at the loom. When they finished the many long strips of cloth, they would sew them together to make the sail for Mikhail. At times, Bree thought she could not bear to look at another piece of yarn. At other times, she remembered how a Viking sail looked, large and majestic, beautiful and filled with wind. In the few times when Bree had a free moment, she put on her warm wool clothing and slipped outside. Sometimes people strapped small pieces of bone to the bottom of their shoes and skated where the ice was free of snow. More often, people skied when they went places. At first, Bree thought the long, narrow sticks on their feet looked strange, but when she saw how quickly Mikhail and Court glided across the snow, Bree wished that she could try. Then she wished for the full moon, a clear sky, and weather in which she could search for her sister. But why didn't Keely find her? Keely, you know where I am, Bree thought more than once. Why don't you come here? I'm your sister. Don't you want to see me? In December, Bree kept track of the days and thought about Christmas. What would it mean to not be able to go to church, light candles, or sing the songs of Christmas? This year she especially wanted to celebrate with Keely. Bree still felt that her sister was very near, close by, yet hidden away. There was one direction where Bree hadn't been able to search. That was where she would go next, the first chance she got. If I could ski like Mikhail on top of the snow, if I could! But Bree couldn't, and even 3 or 4 miles might be a long way in deep snow. Growing up in the Wicklow Mountains, Bree knew how dangerous mountains could be for an inexperienced climber. Before the snows came, she had studied the sides of the mountains around her. Up and down the fjord, there were long, narrow openings or wide, deep hollows. With snow deep upon the land, Bree had to ask herself, where would the ground be solid beneath me? Filled and hidden by snow, the dangers became too big a risk. But she and Dev could celebrate Christmas. Please, Bree said to Rika on Christmas morning. This is a special day when we celebrate the birth of Jesus. May I visit my brother? If you were home, what would you do? Rika asked. Bree thought for a moment. If she said she went to church, someone might expect her to go to the sacred grove. We would light candles, Bree told Rika instead. They're a symbol for us. Taking a key from her belt, Rika unlocked her chest and surprised Bree by taking out a candle. Usually the family used lamps because oil was plentiful. When you celebrate with your brother, light the candle, Rika said. And you celebrate by eating too? Taking out a basket, Rika packed a few small treats. The blacksmith shop where Devon worked was set off from the home, and Bree followed the path through the snow. As she drew near the smithy, Bree heard the pound of the hammer. Then she heard the sound of singing. Was that her brother singing? True, he had a better voice than she. He could sing to someone other than a cow, but it told Bree that Dev was lonely too. Together they gathered around the warmth of the smithy fire. Together they repeated every promise they remembered about Jesus being the light of the world. And then, in the light of the candle, Bree told Devon about the words that had changed how she felt about everything. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, it says in the Bible. Though a slave, Bree had never felt more free than in that moment. You know, Devon said, I've had a lot of time to think while I'm pounding a hammer. It seems like a mistake that we were captured by Vikings, but was it really a mistake? If we believe God protects us, we need to ask, why does he want us here? Mikhail wanted to know what God's protection is, Bree said. He did? Watch out. Maybe Mikhail wants protection for his next voyage. Do you suppose he'll ever change? Bree asked. Devon grinned. If he has the right friends, perhaps. I keep thinking about Sigurd, Bree said. If he could speak at the Assembly of Freemen, he would put in a good word for you. The bad news about their chieftain's leprosy had spread quickly through the surrounding fjords and mountains. What if Sigurd could be healed? Devon asked now. What if God decided to do that? Not just to help me, but to help the people who don't know him. It would be a miracle, Bree. Bree smiled. A miracle, all right. But long before we were born, God started doing miracles. When Bree stood up to leave, she had Christmas in her heart. Devon had Christmas in both his eyes and his smile. Chapter 17, The Storyteller. Between snowfalls, Mikhail tromped down the new path to the boathouse. Whenever possible, he and the men worked on the partly built ship. As Mikhail smoothed the wood, he dreamed of far places and felt eager for spring to come. When the wind blows fair, I'll be gone, he thought. Most days he walked to the jailhouse and brought Devon to the blacksmith shop. There, warmed by the fire, which he worked, Devon made rivets. Metal bolts with a head on one end. The rivets would hold the long overlapping boards of the ship together. To Mikhail's secret relief, Devon no longer coughed. Now as Mikhail started back to the house, he heard laughter from the smithy. Laughter? Wasn't Devon working as he should? In order to finish his ship, Mikhail needed countless rivets. Changing his direction, Mikhail walked that way. Above the laughter came the pound, pound, pound of the hammer. Good, Mikhail thought. They did not have time to waste, but then the hammer stopped. No, you can't come that close. Move back or you won't be safe. It was Devon speaking. Who was he talking to? The children who lived here in the winter? Children who worked as they could because there wasn't enough food deep in the mountains? Staying out of sight, Mikhail listened. There, that's good, Devon said. I will not tell a story if you come too close. Tell a story? Mikhail asked himself. My blacksmith fills my smithy with his stories? But instead of words, Mikhail heard the whoosh of bellows. Bellows fanning the flames, making the iron red hot so it could be worked. And then Devon began speaking again. Between blows of the hammer, he told a story Mikhail had never heard. A story about a brother and a sister playing in the green fields of Ireland. Here and there came the soft, pleasing sigh of a child, most definitely. Now and then someone clapped, but always the blow of the hammer kept ringing. How could Devon work and talk at the same time? Then Mikhail found himself caught up in the story. This was not just any tale, but the story of a brother and a sister living in mountains where mists came and mists went, and the land stayed green forever. Suddenly, Mikhail knew the story was true. At first, Mikhail wanted to walk around the wall and stop the story. Then he wanted to hear it end, and staying out of sight, Mikhail crept closer. Bree and Devon, that's who the brother and sister were. Then, through the laughter of the children who listened, Mikhail felt sad. That's the way it was with Ivar and me. That's what I lost when Ivar died at sea. When tears welled up in his eyes, Mikhail brushed them away. Not for anything would he show how much he missed his favourite brother. As young children, they had always played together. At night around the fire, they shared laughter and secrets. Then, as though still seeing those times, Mikhail saw his brother caught, always left out. Always at the edge of whatever Ivar and Mikhail did. No wonder Court dislikes me, Mikhail thought. Have I always gone my own way without him? Will I someday be sorry for that too? Again, Mikhail thought about the way Bree and David treated each other. Separated by hardship, by distance, by me, Mikhail had to admit. But both took life or death risks to take care of each other. Could Court ever love me that way, he wondered. Mikhail tried to push the thoughts aside, but couldn't. I'm proud of my father and mother. I was proud of Ivar. I wish I could be proud of Court. But then Mikhail had to be honest with himself. Maybe I must first be able to respect myself. But how? Somehow he had managed to hide his darkest secret from his father, but he couldn't hide that secret from himself. Then as he started to slip away, Mikhail saw his brother. Court was also standing just out of sight of Devon and the children. He too was listening. And now Mikhail knew what he needed to do. I'm going to change, he promised himself, but then deep inside, Mikhail wondered if he really could. Chapter 18, Troublemaker. When Devon turned 15, he and Bree celebrated again, this time by telling each other funny stories. But 1 week later, when Mikhail also turned 15, Bree did not feel like celebrating. She only thought about Mikhail's dark secret. Whenever she recalled the stolen bag of coins, Bree remembered its danger to her brother. Each morning, Mikhail gave her and niece the coins he wanted them to melt down. Bree couldn't tell if these came from the raid at Glendalough or Mikhail's theft from his father's friend in Dublin. Neither Bree nor niece had any idea where Mikhail hid his valuable hoard. Often Bree thought about the hack silver Dev had given her. Hide it well, he had said, and Bree had. As niece taught her how to shape jewellery, Bree learned ways to turn silver into something even more valuable. If I make something beautiful, if I can somehow sell it. One afternoon, Bree told the silversmith what she wanted to try. No, Bree, he said at first, it could make trouble. Then niece changed his mind. He understood how Bree felt. He too wanted to be free. Now when niece decided to help Bree, he warned her, you must be very careful. If anyone sees what you're doing, there will be trouble. Since the first day she worked with him, Bree had watched and learned all she could. Now niece showed her how to make a neck ring, a thin silver band moulded and shaped with great care. A pendant hung by a loop from the band. It's beautiful, Bree exclaimed. Niece smiled. Someday you will make neck rings just as beautiful. But Bree didn't want to wait. That night she took the pieces of hack silver from hiding. In the light of the oil lamp she studied the thin wire and small bits and pieces. If she kept the beautifully woven pattern of the largest piece of silver, she could shape it into a pendant. She only needed to make the silver loop that went around a woman's neck. The next day, Bree finished Mikhail's work and then started making her own jewellery. Holding out the piece she wanted for a pendant, Bree used a hammer to pound the bits of hack silver into a long, flat piece. After rolling that silver into a smooth, unbroken line, she polished it into a sparkling strand. Then niece showed Bree how to use the strand in a neck ring that would look like a circular braid. Still working together, they shaped the large, beautifully designed piece of hack silver into a pendant. Then Bree attached the pendant to the silver loop. When she finished, the neck ring was more beautiful than Bree ever imagined possible. Even niece was excited about the unusual beauty of what they had created. It's the kind of jewellery men give their wives to display their wealth, he said. As Bree tucked their creation into a hiding place, she could hardly wait to show it to Devon. But niece reminded Bree, be very, very careful. Then the day came. Full moon tonight, Bree thought during a break in the weather. Tonight she would search for Keely, but first, since Mikhail and Devon were not working that day, Bree asked if she could visit her brother. Feeling like royalty instead of a slave, Bree clasped the silver ring around her neck, then hid it beneath her cloak. With a light heart, she followed one of the snowy paths that wound between houses to the jail. Today, Bree wore pride around her neck. The pride of knowing that even if the Assembly of Freemen didn't return the ransom, she had a way to free her brother. Today, Bree would show Dev the neck ring, then hide it again until needed. The afternoon was warm in the shelter of the mountain. As Bree walked, she pulled open her cloak. When she felt the ring around her neck, she wished she could see the sparkle of the silver strand. Instead, she saw Gina coming around the house ahead of her. Quickly, Bree turned aside, taking a different path to avoid the girl, but Gina also changed paths. When she stood directly in front of her, Bree had no choice but to stop. At first, Gina looked simply into Bree's eyes. Then she moved closer for a better look. "Your neck ring!" she exclaimed. Bree stepped back out of reach. "Where did you get it?" Backing up even further, Bree prepared to run. "How can a slave girl have a neck ring like that? You stole it!" "No!" Bree exclaimed. "I didn't!" Gina's scoffing laugh seemed to echo from the mountainside. Suddenly she called out to a man working nearby, "This thief stole my neck ring!" Bree stared at her. "Your neck ring?" Then with horror, Bree realized that one person after another had stopped what they were doing. From the closest house and from one further away, people hurried over to listen. Within a few minutes, a crowd of people had gathered around Bree and Gina. As Bree looked from one to another, she saw no one knew her, and no one she knew. Bree only knew how hopeless she was. Again, Gina stepped forward, and for a moment, Bree thought Gina would snatch the silver band from her neck. Grabbing hold, Bree clung to it as if it was a matter of life or death. Around them, people muttered. It started first as a low word here or there, then like an angry roar, then mutter rose in Bree's ears. Again she looked around for help. After what seemed like forever, she saw Mikhail on the edge of the crowd. He too looked angry. Filled with panic, Bree again stepped back. With each step she took, Gina pressed towards her. Then, to Bree's surprise, Mikhail stood next to her. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. "Gina says this is her neck ring." "Is it?" "Of course not." "But what is it? Something you made for me to sell?" Bree shook her head. "Something I made for me to sell, to set Dev free." Mikhail stared at her. "But our Ting might do that when they vote." "Maybe," Bree said. "Maybe not." "So you stole hack silver from me to set your brother free?" "No, I didn't steal it from you. But where—" And in that moment, Bree remembered. Devon had told her not to tell anyone where she got the hack silver, and now that was exactly what Mikhail wanted to know. "I cannot tell you," Bree said. "You can't tell me? But it's my silver, isn't it?" he replied. As Mikhail looked around, Bree's gaze followed his. The crowd that surrounded them was growing by the minute. Many of them looked angry, and most, if not all of them, would take Gina's side. Bree felt sure of one thing. She needed to get out of there while she could, and fast. Then, with one quick movement, Mikhail stepped in front of Bree and spoke directly into Gina's face. "Bree works for me. If you want the neck ring, you must buy it." In the same tone of voice, he spoke to Bree. "Come." With long strides and angry steps, Mikhail headed toward his father's long house. By the time they reached the door, Mikhail's anger was so great that he looked like a thunderstorm. "Tell me," he said, "how can you use my silver and then not tell me where it came from?" "It's not your silver," Bree said. "I know you won't believe me, but—" In that moment, Mikhail gave her the biggest surprise of all. "I will believe you, Bree," he said quietly. "Just tell me." When Bree finished explaining, Mikhail asked one more question. "If the Ting lets Devon go, if they let him use the ransom to free you, what will you do with the money from this neck ring?" "Not for anything," would Bree tell him. "That's my secret," she said. Then she realized how much Mikhail had done for her. In those terrible moments of danger and fear, he had given his protection when he didn't need to. "1,000 thanks, Mikhail," Bree said. "I don't know what I would have done without you back there." But Mikhail's face grew hard again. "There's just one thing," he said. "If I can't trust you to not do something so stupid, how can I trust you with walking in the mountains?" Looking down, Bree drew a pattern in the snow with her boots. "Please, God," she prayed desperately, "I need to find Keely tonight." Mikhail's angry voice cut into her prayer. "No walking outside alone," he said. He pointed to the mountain wall on one side of the farm. "That's your boundary right there." Turning to the fjord and the river, he said, "And your boundary is on those two sides." "Please," Bree said as Mikhail turned to the fourth direction. "I want to visit my brother Dev." For a long moment, Mikhail stared at her as though trying to decide, and then he nodded. "You can go to the jail and no further." With a sinking heart, Bree nodded. At least she could see Dev. But Keely, "If you don't obey, I'll tell Mama that you have to stay in the house." "Oh no, Mikhail, I'll die if I'm stuck inside the house." Always, Bree had roamed the mountains. How could she possibly stay indoors every moment of the day or night? What could be worse? Mikhail's cold smile told her he felt very glad he had found exactly the right punishment. "Remember that," he said. "Remember your boundaries." The next time Bree saw Devon in the smithy, she told him how Mikhail had rescued her from Gina. Devon was so upset that he forgot to keep pounding his hammer. Instead, he stared at Bree with utter disbelief. "How did you ever manage to do something like that?" "But I wanted to help," Bree told him. "I turned your hack silver into something really valuable. If the Ting doesn't let you go, I'll have ransom to release you. There's just one thing you didn't think about." In spite of her misery, Bree smiled. "Probably more than one," she said. "No one will ever believe the word of a slave." "One slave and one prisoner." Devon dropped down on a bench. For several minutes he was silent, as though totally unable to speak. Bree stood nearby and stared at the packed earth floor just as long. Finally, Devon looked up. "Bree, don't you know the penalty for stealing? Don't you know what can happen to you?" "I know." Bree's voice was small. "Stealing can be punished with death here." She was tired of hearing about it, even more tired of thinking about it. If I was found guilty, I must pay back what I stole. I must also pay an extra amount to the person I dishonored by taking something from him. "And if Mikhail says you took the silver from him?" "He knows that I didn't," Bree said. "Does he?" "Well," Bree thought about it, "maybe he does and maybe he doesn't. He's got so many silver coins. Maybe he really doesn't know. It could go either way. So it's up to Mikhail again, isn't it?" The fear Bree felt went deep in her bones. "Even if he knows I didn't steal from him, can we trust him to do what's right?" A strange look crossed Devon's face. "Trust, remember? When Mikhail asked me to work for me, he asked me to trust him." "And have you trusted him?" Bree asked. Devon grinned for the first time that day. "Always with one eye open, my sister, watching him." Suddenly, Bree felt that he was her brother again. "Courage to win, Dev," she said. "Courage to win, Bree. Jesus our Lord is Saviour and King. We haven't asked him for help." Bowing their heads, they started to pray for the situation. For the rest of the winter, Bree obeyed Mikhail. For someone who had always been free to roam, staying within his boundaries felt like being in jail. Yet Bree knew one thing. If she stepped beyond the places Mikhail set for her, it would be even worse to not be able to go outside. Then one afternoon, the winds of spring lay warm upon the land. The next day, a line of water appeared between the shore and the ice in the river. Not long after, the water tumbled around rocks in the streams, seeming happy to be set free. On the day that ice and snow disappeared from the lower slopes, Bree saw Mikhail near the fjord. "I've obeyed you," she said to him. "Please, I want to climb the mountains again." Mikhail's steady gaze met hers. "Can I trust you not to run away?" "I promised once," Bree said. "You can trust me." But inside she felt terrible about promising again. Gradually, the deep snows melted on the mountain tops. When Mikhail's mother asked Bree to take grandfather's axe to the boathouse, she set out with a light step. Walking along the sheer rock mountain at the side of the farm, Bree thought about Rika. At first, Bree hadn't been able to understand the quiet ways of these people of the north. Even when he was very angry with Mikhail, Sigurd had chosen his words carefully. By now, Bree had lived on the fjord long enough to know that not everyone was careful with how they showed their feelings. When winter winds raged, keeping people inside for long periods of time, their tempers grew short. But Bree also understood something more, the depth of what these people thought and felt, though they didn't show it outwardly. Their quiet ways did not mean they loved less, nor did their quiet ways mean they couldn't express their thoughts well. Though many of the Norse words were still strange to Bree, she couldn't hear the poetry in them, the promise of story, the song. From watching Sigurd, Rika and the grandparents, there was something Bree knew. Their thoughts and their hearts go deep. Would there ever come a time when there would be no more Viking raids? a time when even Mikhail was honest and trustworthy. Just then, Bree looked down. A few days before, the small stones on the slanted side of the boulder were pushed out of place. Now they were in order again. No longer was there a letter K. The torch had been reshaped and another one added. Between the two torches there was something new. What was it? At first Bree thought the stones outlined a bush without leaves. Then she realized the stones pictured an animal's head. A reindeer? Not a bush, but reindeer antlers? As Bree remembered the reindeer pits on top of the mountains, she noticed something else. Between the sheer rock of the mountain and the water of the fjord was another message. This one was made of larger stones, a round rock first, with a flat enough surface to set more stones on top. A second, third, and fourth stone carefully balanced to build a pillar. And then at the very top, if this was Keely, how had she managed to find such a rock? Rounded on one side, it had a definite wedge-shaped point on the other. Like an arrowhead, the rock pointed along the fjord. Strange, Bree thought. The one direction Rika never sent me. The one direction I didn't have time to take. Suddenly, Bree laughed. Long ago, Bree and Keely had played near the river that flowed past their home. Often they made up special games. This one was a secret between them. Their pointer rocks had marked hiding places when playing with Devon. Keely, you're my invisible friend. But then Bree thought about it. No, God was her true invisible friend. Moments later, Bree heard Rika calling. After one last look, Bree turned away. Tonight, I'll be back. There would be a full moon to help her. When her evening work was done, Bree hurried to the barn and pulled together the things she needed. An extra pair of wool stockings, the warm dress Rika had given her, a scarf, cloak, and mittens. The mountaintop would be cold at night, and Bree felt grateful for every piece of clothing she had. Finally, she put her wool blanket in a basket she could carry on her back. At the last minute, Bree added a rope and the loose-fitting sealskin tunic and leggings she had made earlier. Food? She had saved bread from the evening meal. With the full moon lighting her way, Bree crept out the door of the barn and through the animal pen. When she opened the gate in the stone fence, it squeaked, and Bree stopped and looked around. As she closed the gate, it squeaked again. Bree quickly slipped behind the line of trees at the base of the mountain. Standing there, hidden by pines, Bree waited. All was quiet. Bree stayed behind the trees until she reached the boathouse. There she passed between the fjord and the sheer rock of the mountain. A short distance beyond, she discovered a trail. At first it was wide, but then it narrowed to pass beyond a large rock. When Bree heard a sound behind her, she whirled around. A shadow slipped out of sight. Bree's heart pounded. What was it? Or who was it? Chapter 19, The Reindeer Runs. Without moving, Bree stood there, looking back. Finally, she decided she had imagined that someone was there. Moving on, she picked up her pace. If there was anything she didn't want, it was the wrong person on this trail. Sometimes the path lay close to the water, other times it wound steeply upward, to pass behind rock walls that dropped straight away to the fjord below. A short distance further on, Bree again whirled around. This time she was sure that there was something behind her. When she saw Shadow, Bree groaned. The friendly dog was not known for being quiet. If he barked at the wrong time, he would give her away. Go home, she said. Shadow pricked his ears. Stopping, he looked back, then turned toward Bree as though torn about what to do. Go home, Bree commanded again. Instead, the dog sat down on his haunches. Cocking his head, he tipped it from side to side. Bree started toward him. Go home! Slowly, the dog stood up. As though still not wanting to obey, he wagged his tail. Even in the moonlight, his eyes looked sad. I'm not going to change my mind, Bree told him. Go home! After one more mournful look, Shadow turned again around and started back to the farm. Bree hurried on, but soon heard another noise behind her. This time it was Flurry who followed her. Bree couldn't believe what she was seeing. Who had opened the gate? And why was Flurry wearing her harness? As though she and Shadow had talked about it, the horse seemed just as set on following her. It gave Bree a strange feeling. It was almost as if they wanted to keep her safe. Bree pushed the thought away. She didn't care to think about danger. She only wanted to find Keely. But the way the animals acted made her uneasy. When the mare reached her, Bree stroked her neck. Flurry's snuffle in her ears was full of satisfaction. All right, you can go with, Bree told her softly, but be quiet. Bree set out again with Flurry following. In the moonlight, the fjord looked clear and cold, filled with a beauty Bree seldom had the opportunity to see. Her heart leapt as she looked at the mountains on the far side. She was on her way to see Keely. Excitement raced in Bree's heart. Excitement warmed her insides and gave her courage for the unknown. Keely will be there. I'll get to talk with my sister. With every step, Bree looked forward to seeing the laughter in her sister's eyes. Keely's love for life spilled over to everyone around her. Before long, clouds moved across the moon. As the night grew dark, Bree felt afraid of the steep, dangerous path. At first, it had been easy to see the steep drops to the fjord. Now they were hidden from her. It was difficult enough when the moon shone brightly. How could she walk without light? When Flurry nudged her aside, Bree caught hold of a strap in her harness and let the mare take the lead. Soon Bree felt glad that she had kept the sure-footed animal with her. In rocky stretches hidden by shadow, it grew more and more difficult to walk. Some of the rocks still had slippery spots. Bree tried to take each step where Flurry did. As Bree passed through the narrow places in the path, she stayed close to the mare's side. Now the mountain rose above her. Clouds still covered the moon and stars. Here the wind did not reach her, and Bree felt sheltered from the cold. High above the fjord, she came to a cluster of farm buildings. Standing at a distance, she stopped and wondered what to do next. Then she saw it, another column of stacked stones, this one pointing to a trail up the mountain. Her hand on Flurry's bridle, Bree whispered in her ears, "Shh now." Without making a sound, they circled wide around the buildings. Beyond, they began climbing again. Here there was snow, and with it footprints of the right size for Keely. Sure that she would find her sister soon, Bree moved ahead following the prints in the snow. The mountain was steep here, but the trail was not dangerous. Usually Bree climbed with the skill of a mountain goat, yet as she passed through a pine forest, it seemed that she walked forever. "Keely, what are you doing?" Bree wondered more than once. "Why are we meeting so far away?" Bree hurried now in spite of the steep climb. She had no choice but to be back before daylight. Finally she reached the top of the mountain and it levelled out. Here on the heights the wind swept across the open ground and with it came snow. Leaning into the wind, Bree bent her head. The snow prickled her skin like tiny ice balls. Quickly she wrapped a scarf over her nose, forehead and mouth. Yet with each step she felt the ice spitting against her eyes. In some places snow lay in drifts between the rocks. In other places the earth was bare. Here there were few trees and wind had swept away Keely's footprints. Bree stared at the ground and saw something. Suddenly she felt the terror of it. Am I here alone? Where is Keely? Then Bree reached out, touched Flurry's mane and patted her strong neck. As if trying to offer comfort, Flurry stamped her hoof. Unsure what to do, Bree stood there looking around. As she waited, the wind blew the clouds away from the moon and Bree saw a small hut. Built of stone, it lay under a rock overhanging. Its door was so low that Bree would have to stoop to enter. But then she remembered Flurry. Bree couldn't risk having the mare wander off. Opening the bag she carried on her back, Bree took out the rope and tied one end to a ring in Flurry's harness. With the mare standing out of the wind, Bree took the loose end of the rope with her. When she crawled into the small hut, the hollow area beneath the overhang shut away the wind, snow, and cold. An opening in the outer wall gave Bree the ability to look out. Bree felt sure it was a shelter used by hunters. For a moment she sank down, breathed deep and rested. But then she grew sleepy and knew how deadly that might be. Going outside again, Bree coiled the rope and pushed it under a strap in Flurry's harness. "Keely! Keely!" Bree called. "Where are you?" The wind caught her voice and flung it back. "Keely! Keely!" Over and over Bree called, but the wind snatched away the sound. "Keely!" Afraid to leave the hut, afraid she would lose her bearings and become stranded, Bree stood still. In that white wasteland, was there no tree, no brush, no outcrop of rock? Nothing to help her find her way back? Then Bree saw that off to her right was one lone tree. Her gaze on that tree, Bree caught Flurry's bridle and set out across the ground filled with blowing snow. Partway there, Bree remembered Rika's words, "Reindeer runs." Deep inside, Bree sensed the warning, open pits. Pits to catch the reindeer as they ran across the mountain tops. Pits so deep that even a reindeer could not leap back out. Bree's shiver had nothing to do with cold now. When she found a branch, she used it to feel the ground in front of her. With one hand still on Flurry's bridle and her other hand holding the stick, Bree moved forward slowly. Before each step, she tested the ground with a stick. With each place Bree set her foot, she watched to see if Flurry walked there first. Again and again, Bree called out, "Keely, where are you?" Bree had almost reached the tree when she heard a voice. "Bree, help me!" The voice sounded so far away that Bree moved quickly, forgetting to feel the ground. Just in time, she tapped the stick. The ground had vanished. In that instant, Flurry backed away. Pulling Bree with her, terror in her heart, Bree dropped to her knees. When she reached out, she felt the edge of a hole, the edge of nothing. "Keely," Bree called, "where are you?" "In a hole." Keely's voice was closer now, but eerie sounding. From where Bree knelt, afraid to move, she looked down into a pit lined with stones. In the moonlight, she could see that the sides of the long, narrow pit fell away to nothing. Beyond Bree, the pit was covered with brush and larger branches that hid the opening. "Keely, is it really you?" A small voice rose from the darkness. "It's really me." Bree's heart thumped. From Devon's description, this wasn't what she expected. She had expected arms thrown around her, one of Keely's famous hugs. And then Bree knew. "Are you hurt?" "I'm hurt bad." "Your head?" Bree asked. "Your arms? Your back?" "My right foot. I can climb out of most anything, but these sides are straight up and down." "Where are you?" "Move along the side," Keely said. "Keep talking," Bree told her. On her hands and knees, Bree crawled around outside the pit, moving carefully past the brush that hid the opening. At last she knelt over the spot where she heard Keely best. It was still too dark to see her sister. "I'm cold, Bree, really cold." Quickly, Bree pushed branches aside and opened the bag she carried on her back. The sealskin tunic and leggings spilled out. Bree dropped the tunic down, then ripped the bottom of the right leg in case Keely's foot was swollen. "Can you put these on over your clothes?" Bree's warm blanket was next in the bag, but then she remembered the rope tied to a ring in Flurry's harness. Keely was light and climbed well most of the time. With stiff fingers, Bree made a loop in the free end of the rope. "Grab hold," she called as she threw it down to her sister. "Can you get to the end of the pit and walk up the wall?" Flurry planted her feet, ready to help, but it was more difficult than it sounded. When Keely fell back, Bree knew she had hurt herself more than she wanted to admit. Again, Bree called down, "When we pull up, push your good foot against the wall of the pit. Lean back." Again, Keely clung to the rope. With one foot bouncing against the wall, she let Flurry pull her higher and higher. At last, Bree caught hold of Keely's arm and helped her the rest of the way. When they both knelt a safe distance from the pit, they threw their arms around each other. Bree had forgotten what it meant to feel her sister's hug, and suddenly both of them were sobbing. Keely pulled back first to look at her older sister. "If Daddy and Mum could only see us now." Bree giggled with her, hugging instead of fighting. Again they hugged, and then Bree helped Keely onto Flurry's back. When they reached the shelter for hunters, their words tumbled out. For all this time, Keely had lived on the farm that Bree had passed on her way up the mountain. Because she too slept in a barn, she was able to creep out at night, and often did. What could they do now that they were together? "I brought food," Keely said. "Let's keep going over the mountains." But Bree had seen her sister flinch every time she tried to put weight on her foot. It was surprising that Keely hadn't hurt herself more. "We can't," Bree said. "Yes, we can. You can creep down and get Dev." Through the moonlight that reached into the shelter, Bree saw Keely's face. Light seemed to fill even her eyes. "Oh, Bree, I heard Dev playing the pipes, the lullaby Mum used to sing to us. I saw him come in, just like I saw you come in. First you, then my brother." Keely's face crumpled with just the thought of it. "After 6 years." "Keely, are you all right?" Bree asked. "Really, really all right?" Keely blinked away her tears. "Daddy and Mum, they prayed for me, didn't they?" Bree nodded. "We all prayed for you. Adam and Kara and Kent and Jen prayed for you too." "Kara? Jen?" And then Bree really knew what Keely had lost. 6 years. Bree had forgotten how long 6 years would be for her sister. "You don't know, do you?" Bree asked gently. "Your brother Adam is 7 now, and you have 2 new sisters, Kara and Jen. And didn't you wonder if we'd ever see each other again?" "Think about it," Keely said. "Even when I was a girl no more than this high," she held out her hand. "Brother Cronin talked about miracles. It's a miracle, isn't it, that we found each other?" Bree agreed. "A miracle, all right. Someone must have told Mikhail about the monastery. Well, let's ask God for another miracle, that we get away." Bree had no problem with that prayer, but when Keely wanted to leave in the next moment, Bree had to hold her back. We'll escape, she promised, but we have to plan it right. If they know we're sisters, they'll keep us apart, Keely said. They won't give us a chance to escape. Is that why you kept hiding from me? Bree asked, so we wouldn't meet in the open? Keely nodded. During the winter, they caught me sneaking out at night, and they set a watch on me. But before that, you came at night, Bree said. Why didn't you find me then? I couldn't come every night, and the dogs always barked. I knew they'd wake everyone up, but someone walks outside the house where you live. Bree stared at her. And around the barn? Often Bree had wondered if she had heard footsteps. Who is it? A man or older boy? I couldn't get close enough to tell. He paces, going back and forth like something is wrong. Chapter 20, On Trial. Keely leaned forward. Bree, is there some way we can creep down and rescue Dev? This was a choice Bree dreaded. I needed to make a trade, she said. I needed freedom to search for you, but I had to promise that I would not run away. To Bree's surprise, Keely understood. The sister who had always darted this way and that, flitting like an elf between trees, put it straight. You're right, Bree. You have to keep a promise. That settled it. From then on, they talked about ways to meet again, and their hope for all three of them to be free. When they went outside again, Bree helped Keely onto Flurry's back. As though knowing she carried a precious load, the mare stepped carefully across the mountaintop and down the trail. As daylight crept upon the fjord, Bree left Keely as close as possible to the farm where she lived. With tears in their eyes, they hugged each other goodbye. Don't forget our secret signal, Keely said, reminding Bree to watch for pointer rocks. They would meet halfway between the two farms on the trail next to the fjord. 3 nights from now, Keely told her. Then using Bree's stick, she limped away. When Bree was safely on the trail again, she stopped at a high point and looked across the deep blue waters of the fjord. A dusting of snow still lay on the top of the mountains. Off to Bree's left, the spray of a waterfall tumbled down a steep slope. As Bree watched the falling water, all that had happened to her seemed to fit into place. She, Dev, and Keely had walked through hard days. No doubt there were more hard days to come. But now as Bree took a deep breath, the weight of all she had carried fell away. Lord, you have set my heart free. For a time, Bree stood there, unable to move on. Then she remembered. At the farm, Mikhail would miss Flurry first, and then he'd miss her. She could be accused of stealing the horse. At the beginning of the trail along the fjord, Bree slapped the mare's rump. Go on home, Flurry turned her head, looking at Bree, and then obeyed. Walking quickly into the growing light, Bree followed her. This time the song she hummed was not for grandmother or for Molly the cow. By now Bree knew it wasn't her voice that counted most, but her grateful heart. As she left the trail and passed the boathouse, Mikhail came outside. You're back, he said. Yes, I'm back, Bree answered. You could have kept going over the mountains. Why didn't you? More than anything in her life, Bree had wanted to rescue Dev and keep going. Couldn't they somehow have managed? Regret filled Bree at the thought of it. And then she met Mikhail's gaze. Because I promised you. You didn't think about breaking that promise? Bree smiled. Of course, with all my heart I wanted to break that promise. I never would have seen you again, Mikhail said. Bree heard the strangeness in Mikhail's voice and then the wonder that she had stayed. Why? Mikhail's question shot out like an arrow. Why did you come back? Bree thought about it. There on the mountain, what had she known? Truth could set Mikhail free. If she broke her promise to not run away, what would happen to him? Then Bree remembered the reason that Keely also understood. Well, I knew that if I broke a promise, you would think that all the other things I've said are not true as well. Once more Bree set out. She had nearly reached the barn when she saw Court standing next to the stone fence. When Bree tried to slip past him, he called to her. You came back, Court said, just as Mikhail had. Bree stopped. When she looked at this brother, who always seemed on the edge of the family, she knew. Why do you walk outside at night? Court's face showed his surprise. At first it seemed he would not answer, but then he said, I can't sleep trying to figure things out. I never thought I'd have to take Ivar's place. That was bad enough. With my father sick, it's even worse. How can I do things the way he would do them? How can I be like him? You don't have to be like either of them, Bree said. Just take care of the land and the people. But how can I care for others when I don't even like my own brother? How can I be fair if I can't be fair with him? Mikhail succeeds at everything he does. Not quite, Bree said. It couldn't be called success to steal from his father's friend, but she couldn't say that to Mikhail's brother. You came here as a slave, but you've been kind to us. How do you do it? Court asked. Bree knew she hadn't done it by herself, But would Court understand that? Well, I started to love grandmother, she said. I had to choose to forgive. Then Bree remembered the night Molly the cow talked. I had to stop feeling sorry for myself and try to help others. When Court grinned as though saying yes, it was the first time Bree saw him smile. You're the one who let the mare out, isn't it? She said. I saw you leave. I wanted you to be free, but I wanted you to be safe. Thank you, Bree said. Flurry saved my life. As she opened the gate and started through the pen to the barn, she saw Mikhail standing between the pines as if listening. Then the last of the ice and snow melted, and spring was full upon the land. Eagles soared above the mountains, seals swam in the fjord but disappeared whenever a boat came close. One morning, Bree stood in the doorway of the longhouse and heard the call of a bird she knew well. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Bree stared at the sheer rock that rose straight up along the edge of the farm. The call came from the left side of the mountain. As Bree watched, the bird flew to the right side. As it perched there, calling out its cuckoo, it reminded Bree of home. That afternoon, Bree found Devon working alone. None of the children who loved to hear his stories were there. No one lingered outside the smithy. We can talk, Bree said. So begin, Dev told her. He was building up muscles from his work as a blacksmith and was wise enough to keep pounding his hammer while they talked. Bree found a small stool and pulled it close enough to talk without being heard. To her surprise, Dev admitted his discouragement. When the assembly of freemen meets, who will speak for me, he asked. Well, Sigurd would have defended you, Bree said. He would speak against Mikhail. How can he be just when his own son would lose the ransom money? Bree had thought about that. It's because he loves his son that Sigurd would be fair. He doesn't want Mikhail to get by with something he shouldn't. Devon sighed. Well, whatever Sigurd might do, I guess it doesn't count. With leprosy, he can't do anything. As Bree stood up to go, her brother stopped her. Do you know what bothers me the most? Sometimes I really like Mikhail. If things were different, we could be good friends. Like brothers even. But the Viking raid, the coins he stole, Mikhail doesn't know I know about the coins, but they keep coming between us. I know, Bree said. The same things upset her. It's like he's a slave to greed, Devon said. Bree remembered Sigurd's words on her first day in Orland. That's what his father said. He told Mikhail, unless you find a way to set your actions right, you'll be a slave to what you have done. Devon stared at Bree. No wonder you think that Sigurd is a wise and just man. Mikhail could be too, she added. Her brother grinned. But how will he ever manage to change? Each time Bree brought food to Sigurd, she knocked on a small door similar to the one in jail. The opening was just big enough for passing food and a plate and water. Today, Mikhail's father was standing in the doorway, looking across the field to the river and the fjord. Like Devon, Sigurd seemed to be growing more discouraged with each day. Tomorrow, my friends will come from far and near, he said, as he spoke about the assembly of freemen. They'll talk together and make wise choices, and I will not be there. As Sigurd took his plate from Bree, he asked, Your brother Devon, how is he doing? He's a good blacksmith, she said. He's lost count of the rivets he's made for Mikhail. Sigurd looked pleased, but then asked, Who will speak for him at the ting? Yes, who, Bree wondered. Who will take Devon's side? I don't know, she said. Forcing back her tears, Bree turned away. Was there anyone else as wise as Sigurd and trusted enough for people to listen? But then Sigurd asked her about Naaman the leper. I have built great ships and sailed to far places. How would I get to the Jordan River? Oh, you don't have to go there, Bree said. When Jesus was here on earth, he healed lepers. You can go to him. This Jesus, Sigurd said. We have many gods, but none by that name. Is he another god? No, Bree said. He's the only true God, the one who died on a cross for you. We have a God like that. He hung upside down in a tree to gain knowledge. Is your God also cruel? Bree shook her head. Jesus hung head up with a sign that said, This is Jesus, King of the Jews. But he did it because he loves us. Jesus is the one to ask for help. What kind of help? Sigurd asked. With everything, Bree said. Even if you don't get better, even if your leprosy doesn't go away, it would help you to know him. He would comfort you when you're alone, away from your family. For a time, Sigurd stood there silent, but seeming to think it through. Finally, he spoke. This Jesus, would he want to help me when I have never done anything for him? Oh, yes, Bree exclaimed. That's how he is. If he was here on Earth, he would reach out his hand and touch you. But he's not here, Sigurd said. Now that we can see, not that we can see, but he tells us to just come to him, the way you would talk with one of your friends. Again Sigurd stood there without speaking. His thoughtful look reminded Bree of the day that Mikhail brought home a ship filled with slaves. This wise man was so close to understanding how Jesus could set him free, but how could she ever explain? Then Bree knew. Sigurd's words had stayed with her all these months. When she was discouraged, they had brought comfort and hope. Do you remember what you said to Mikhail on my first day here, she asked. You told him, you're a slave to whatever you serve. When Sigurd nodded, Bree again saw pain in his eyes. Someday there will not be slavery in my country. I want Mikhail to be a merchant, not a raider. And you, Bree, you should not be a slave. I'm not a slave, Bree said. And in that moment, she realized she was no longer afraid of catching leprosy. Instead, she only felt glad that she could talk to Sigurd in this way. I'm more free than Mikhail. She began to tell Sigurd about it. And this Jesus, he finally asked, he really would help me when I've never done anything for him? He would help you in the way he knows is best for you, replied Bree. I must think, Sigurd said, turning back into the small building. I must consider. As Bree watched, he closed the door behind him. When Bree looked outside the next morning, boats of all kinds were already streaming into the fjord. Some were simple boats for bringing hay from the mountain pastures. Others were proud Viking longships. By mid-morning, every piece of shore had been taken up. People were also walking in from the mountains. Soon tents sprang up wherever there was room. The only area left open was part of the large field behind the chieftain's house. There children played on the green meadow. Young men competed in archery and women set out food. As Bree watched, she saw that people followed a certain order. Whether eating, talking or playing games, everyone left an opening around the rounded earth mound where the law speaker would stand. When it came time for the meeting of freemen to begin, people sat down on the grassy slopes, facing that mound. Like sand on the seashore, they spread across the land between the Ordland River and the mountain. At the back of the crowd, Bree stood beside her brother. His 2 guards stood on the other side behind Devon. Neither guard had seen fit to bind his hands, perhaps because he had worked among them as a blacksmith, but Bree noticed their watchful eyes. As she looked around, Bree saw a slender girl with sandy-coloured hair, a dusting of freckles across her nose, and dark brown eyes just like their mother's. Keely's long braid bounced whenever she moved. Sunlight danced in her eyes and caught the funny tuft of hair on the top of her head. Someone had cut a branch with a Y-shaped notch to help Keely walk. Though she used it for support now and then, there was nothing else in Keely that leaned. When she grinned at Bree, it was the grin she wore when she was up to something, often a trick on Bree or Dev. But when Bree started her way, Keely shook her head. She was still being wise, acting as if she did not know either Bree or Dev. With Gina lurking around, Bree felt glad. Keely and Lil had found each other. Watching them, Bree knew they could be lifelong friends. But where would they live? If Bree had anything to say about it, it would be Ireland. Near the law speaker's mound, Mikhail sat on the ground beside his brother Court. When she saw them talking, Bree felt surprised, then upset. Why would they be together unless they had reached an agreement? And wouldn't any agreement be against Dev? Bree sighed and tried to ignore the tight knot in her stomach. The two brothers had power. Were they not the chieftain's sons? And Mikhail had given work to many men. Who would vote against him? Who would say that Mikhail should not have the money? And who would say that a slave captured on a raid to Ireland should be allowed to go free? On the other hand, if they freed Devon, they might also free her. The possibility was so exciting that Bree could barely stand there. But then the fear that it might never happen washed over her like a wave in the stormy North Sea. One free man after another stood to speak. Then came the most persuasive of all. When we trap the fox that roam our mountains, we set the trap carefully, he said, but the hunter does not choose which fox will be caught. It is the fox himself that decides whether he will be caught. He chooses whether to enter the trap in search of the bait. Throughout the audience, men grinned at each other. Without doubt, they knew what the speaker was saying. On our raid to Ireland, the boy of whom we speak became a prisoner. When, out of the kindness of his heart, Mikhail set him free to return home. But then that prisoner, of his own free will, walked back into the trap. Do we need to be kind again? What if our enemies hear of it? Is it not important that they fear us, that they know how strong we are? Do we not have peace because they are afraid of us? From all over the crowd, cheers broke out. One man after another waved his arms in the air, agreeing with the speaker. Bree felt a coldness in her hands, then in her heart. Reaching out, she took her brother's hand. It felt just as cold as her own. As though trying to offer comfort, Devon squeezed her hand, then let it go. Then as Bree looked around, she saw Hawk standing at the side of the crowd. His face was serious, his eyes as piercing as always. But then Hawk smiled. Smiled? The man with Hawk had his back toward Bree. When he turned, Bree saw his face. Sigurd? Mikhail's father? Could it possibly be? As Sigurd started forward through the crowd, he walked like a warrior with shoulders back and head held high. His grey-white hair and beard were trimmed close, and his face seemed filled with light. When he passed between the people in one row, then another, they looked his way, and suddenly they realized who he was. All through the crowd, people stood up and grabbed the arm of a person nearby. Like a wave rolling in from the sea, excited voices rose as one person told another. Following close behind Sigurd, Hawk walked as though bearing armour for a king. When the two men reached the open area next to the law speaker's mount, they bowed before him. The crowd fell silent. Hawk spoke first. Respected law speaker, I have come to verify the health of our honourable chieftain Sigurd. He is no longer unclean. He is full of good health. Clasping Sigurd's hand, Hawk held it high. The crowd broke into a cheer. Had God really done a miracle? Even though Bree knew he could do anything he wanted, she still found it hard to believe. Then Bree looked at Devon, and Devon looked at Bree. When Devon grinned, he stood with head held back, looking up. He looked up for a long time to heaven. Chapter 21, Slave or Free. When everyone quieted down, Sigurd bowed toward the law speaker, then faced the crowd. Good people of the Outlaw fjord, he began. Turning from one side of the audience to the other, Sigurd continued by greeting those from other fjords and mountains near and far. As Sigurd spoke, Bree was surprised at the strength in his voice. From where she stood near the back, she could hear every word. There are those who say we do not have to show kindness, but what if no kindness was shown to us? We are talking about a ransom to set free a prisoner who has been kind to us. Suddenly people turned and looked toward the back, seeking Bree out. Their notice of her made Bree uncomfortable. Trying to hide her feelings, she set her gaze on the mountain behind where Sigurd stood. Today the sun reached into the valley from that direction. As Sigurd went on, even the small children were silent, listening. Today we speak about something much bigger than one person, 2, 3, or 4. We speak about something that goes far beyond the Outlaw fjord. Holding out his hand, Sigurd motioned toward the mountains in front of him, behind, to his left and to his right. Something even bigger than our mountains, something that lives after us, that makes us who we are. Do we face a small decision or a large one? Do we want a decision that says we are small people or big of heart? Do we want a decision that says we are just and fair? In the history of our world, there have been Norwegians of other times and places who have faced such a choice. In the future, there will be people in other lands who ask themselves this question. We cannot choose for them, only for ourselves. Can a person who brings ransom for another be taken as a prisoner? Can that person be enslaved himself, put in jail and left there? And if he can, then who among us will rescue a friend or a neighbour who needs help? This time, Devon stretched out his hand to Bree. Clasping hers, Devon stood there motionless and watchful. Shoulders back, head high, he waited. When Sigurd sat down, the law speaker called for a vote. Freemen of the mountains and fjords, you gather here to make wise and just decisions. First, should the young man known as Devon O'Toole of Ireland be set free? In the silence that followed, one freeman after another raised his hand. Fingers balled in a fist, they held their arms outstretched towards the law speaker. Then somewhere near the front a cry began, "Yes! Yes! Yes!" Turning, the law speaker looked from one upheld hand to another. When the law speaker nodded, they lowered their arms. Hardly daring to breathe, Bree stole a look at Devon. The law speaker waited for silence and spoke again. "The second choice is this. Should the ransom money be returned to the young man who came to set his sister free?" Watching and waiting, Bree caught her breath. Everyone knew it was Mikhail, the chieftain's own son, who would lose. Return the money to a foreigner, an Irishman, so he could use that money to set free an Irish slave? Down near the law speaker's mount, a freeman raised his hand. With a balled fist, he extended his arm toward the law speaker. Nearby, another freeman raised his arm. To the left and to the right, one arm after another went up. Again, the law speaker looked from one upheld arm to another. Then it seemed that every freeman in that great crowd lifted his arm toward the speaker. Suddenly, one man stood up, and another joined him. Like a wave rolling in from the sea, it swept from the river side of that great assembly toward the mountain. One person after another rose to his feet as though proud to be part of something so good. Tears in her eyes, Bree squeezed her brother's hand. Then Keely was there, standing between them, clasping their hands. The funny tuft of hair on top of her head stood up. Her long braid swung down her back. When she offered her lopsided grin, she too was weeping. Then the law speaker called Mikhail, Devon, and Bree forward. Picking up the bag of ransom money, the law speaker gave it to Devon. As Devon handed the money to Mikhail, he spoke in a solemn voice. "I pay this to you, Mikhail, in order to set free my sister, Brianna." Free! For one moment, Bree stood there, before the law speaker and the freeman who had given respect to her and Devon. For one moment, Bree felt the miracle of it. Free! Then Mikhail spoke. "I accept this ransom from you, Devon O'Toole, for the freeing of your sister, Brianna." When Mikhail turned to Bree, he lowered his voice. "I'm so sorry to see you go, though." As tears welled up in his eyes, Mikhail stopped, swallowed hard, and went on. "But I am glad that you will be free." Free! Again, Bree felt the miracle of it. Standing there, she wanted to feel the moment forever. But then as Mikhail brushed a hand across his eyes, Bree looked up to the law speaker. "I would like to give my freedom to my sister Keely instead." Facing the crowd, Bree motioned to Keely. As she started forward, a murmur went from one person to the next. Mikhail just stared at Bree. "This is your sister? And you want to give your freedom away for her?" Bree nodded, then spoke quietly to the law speaker. "And I would like to give this as ransom for an 8-year-old girl. Would it be enough?" Taking the neck ring she had hidden beneath her cloak, Bree handed it to the law speaker. He in turn gave it to another man. As they talked between them, Bree looked back to Lil. The 8-year-old was doing her best to look happy for Keely. But Bree knew Lil too well. She was really doing her best not to cry. Then the law speaker spoke to Bree. "The answer is yes," he said, "and it would pay for her passage home too." By vote of the assembly, both Keely and Lil were now set free. When Devon, Bree, Keely and Lil walked to the back of the crowd, they went down to the fjord. Keely was still stunned by what had happened. "For a minute I thought you both would leave me." "No, no," Bree exclaimed. "Devon, I could never leave you." "But how can we leave you?" "Mom and Daddy haven't seen you for 6 years. You should be the one to go. Are you sure you're making the right choice?" Suddenly, Bree felt as if Keely was the older sister. "I'm sure," Bree answered. "I want you to go home with Devon." For another moment, Keely stood there, as though still unable to believe what had happened. Then one tear slid down her cheek. As that tear reached her chin, she started sobbing as if she suddenly felt all the loneliness she had known for years. When Bree opened her arms, Keely walked into them. "Oh, Bree," she said at last, when she could finally speak, "I never thought I'd be free. I never thought I'd see you or Dev or Mum or Daddy or Adam again." "Don't forget your 2 new sisters too," Bree said softly. Keely's smile was like sunlight coming through clouds. "It's hard to imagine, isn't it? I can't even think what it will be like to see them when I don't know they were there." As Bree turned to her 8-year-old friend Lil, could barely speak too. "I will never forget you, Bree. Lil said when she could thank her. Thanks for being my big sister. But Devon also asked Bree, are you sure about this? Bree blinked her tears away. I'm sure about this. I ache inside, but I'm sure. I thought about it all winter long. Then Mikhail was there, looking from one to the other. Keely is going home, and Lil, and you, Devon? Take Keely and Lil to Island, and then come back. No, Dev, Bree said quickly. You must not come back. She wasn't willing to take another chance on what might happen. But her brother's steady gaze met hers. Both of them knew that Bree still needed a way to get home. Come back and be my storyteller, Mikhail said. I'm Irish, Dev told him. I'm not like your poets. I don't think that way. Doesn't matter, Mikhail answered. Storytelling is in your bones. If you and Bree go with me on my one voyage, I'll set her free when we return home. Free, Bree thought. The word hung in the air between them. Always she had been free to roam the mountains that she loved. Always she had been free to learn and grow and wonder what lay beyond the Irish Sea. But Mikhail's world was even bigger. Not only had he dreamed about sailing to faraway places, he had actually done it. And now he had built a new ship that would probably go even further. If Mikhail did explore distant seas, where would he sail? What lands would he see? What would it mean if she and Dev were able to go with him? But Devon still stood there waiting as though trying to decide. Mikhail still faced him, and Mikhail spoke again. Be my storyteller, he said, but most of all, be my friend. Devon looked Mikhail straight in the eye. One voyage and you will set my sister free, Devon said. I will be your storyteller, and I will be your friend. When Mikhail stretched out his hands, they shook on it. Turning, Bree looked at the fjord. The high mountain with the waterfall that spilled over the top lay before her. Beyond the Outlaw fjord, beyond the long waterway that led to the western islands and the sea, what lay beyond? After seeing the world, she would really be free? She could really go home? Her heart filled with gladness as she smiled. Post notes that you might be interested in. When we meet someone, we often ask, where do you live or where are you from? It's an easy way to get acquainted. The places we know best are fun to talk about. They're also an important part of who we are. But if you live in a small town or a farming community, think about what it would be like to have 2,800 people leave your area suddenly. That's what happened between 1840 and 1920 in Outlaw, the area in Norway used as a setting in this novel. Because of that emigration, there are now countless Americans who trace their ancestry to the Outlaw fjord. I'm especially indebted to Anders Ornstad, historian, author, and retired high school teacher who helped me with his articles and books. His in-depth knowledge, his thoughtful understanding of people and events, and his warm Norwegian welcome. The local history centre in Outlaw houses a fine museum. Nearby is the beautiful Viking church. Built in the early Gothic style, the cornerstone for this church was laid in 1202. The Otternes Museum, located further along the Outlaw fjord, is also of great interest. If you're acquainted with Norwegian fjords, you'll know that most of them do not freeze in cold weather. However, the inner part of a fjord may freeze. As an arm of the Sogne Fjord, the Outlaw fjord is about 130 miles in from the Norwegian Sea. Within the memory of people who live in the area, the fjord, the Outlaw River, and a spring used for drinking water usually froze over in winter. Today we understand the importance of the Vikings who set foot on North American soil approximately 500 years before Columbus. But do we also understand their influence on the legal system? Our right to hold a trial, to decide who is innocent or guilty, and our right to vote. In his book Encyclopedia of the Viking Age, John Haywood writes about Findan, an Irishman who was sent to ransom his sister. Findan was clapped in irons while his sister's captors decided what to do with him. The Ting scene in this novel is based on a Viking decision that is not ethical to kidnap people who come to pay ransom. The disease called leprosy in the Bible is also called Hansen's disease because of the work of G. Armo Hansen, a physician in Bergen, Norway. In 1874, he discovered the bacillus, the rod-shaped bacterium that causes leprosy. So there's just a few extra little tidbits that you might find interesting that came up in this story. I'm so glad that we could share this book with you, book 3 in the Viking Quest series, and we'll have the others coming up soon. But most of all, I hope that you too can get to know Jesus as your personal friend, your Savior, and your Redeemer. He would honestly change your life. Why don't you choose to get to know Him today and give your heart to Him?